The dawn broke cold over Last Light Basin, not with the warm promise of day, but like a bruise spreading across the gray flannel sky. The wind, relentless in this high country, carried the smell of cured grass, alkali dust, and the metallic tang of old iron. Lark Ellison stood alone at the foot of a low rise, the only sound the thud and scrape of her shovel biting into the hard-packed earth. This was Juniper Hollow, her land, and this was her husband, Peter, wrapped in his canvas bedroll in the grave she was digging. She was digging it with their wedding shovel. The hickory handle was smooth, darkened by 3 years of work and sweat. Peter had carved their initials into it, just below the hilt, and burned the words, "Our Beginning." 1868. It had planted their first fence posts, dug the foundation for the smokehouse, and now it was digging its last duty for him. No one else was here. Not the preacher from Gray Butte. Not the neighbors from the low-water ranches. The only mourners were a jury of crows, shifting impatiently on the skeletal branches of a dead cottonwood, their caws like rattling stones. Lark, owner of Juniper Hollow, was a woman carved from the same unforgiving landscape as the basin itself. Her heavy black mourning shawl was pulled tight, but it couldn't hide the strength in her shoulders or the defiant set of her jaw. Her hands, wrapped around the handle, were chapped and calloused, yet they trembled, not with grief, though that was a cold stone in her belly, but with a simmering, acidic rage. Thud, scrape. The hole was deep enough. He'd always said he wanted to be buried high, where he could see the herd. With a grunt, she leveraged the shovel one last time, tossing the final pile of dark earth onto the mound. She leaned on the handle, her breath pluming white. She looked at the raw earth, this scar on her land, and whispered to the wind, "You didn't fall, Peter." Her voice was raw, stripped of tears. He didn't stumble. The herd didn't just spook. Someone drove you off that ridge. Someone pushed you into that ravine. The official story, already snaking its way through the canyons and into town, was a tragic accident. A stampede. They called it Peter Ellison, a cattleman born and bred, somehow spooked his own herd and was driven over the edge of the red notch. Lark knew better. She had been the one to find him 2 days ago. She had seen the signs the hastily assembled posse had missed, or perhaps chosen to ignore. She remembered the way the ground was torn up, not the chaotic churning of a panicked herd, but the deliberate, deep-gouging tracks of 2 shod horses, pressing in. And the shoes, they were wrong. They had a strange, curved hook on the heel, a mark she'd never seen on any rancher's horse in the basin. And the reins, Peter's reins hadn't snapped from a panicked pull. She had found the leather end. It was sliced clean, smooth as a barber's razor cut, not the frayed, torn break of leather giving way to force. Someone had cut his control just as they drove the cattle at him. A sound pulled her from the memory, the slow, tired tread of a single horse. She turned, her hand instinctively tightening on the shovel handle. A man sat atop a lean bay gelding at the edge of her property line, where the wild sage met her grazed pasture. He was a silhouette against the rising sun, long and still in the saddle. He didn't ride forward, just watched her for a long moment. His hat pulled low. He seemed to be sculpted from the dust itself, his duster the color of the dry earth, his face shadowed. He finally nudged his horse forward, stopping a respectful 20 yards away. He dismounted, his movements economical and quiet, betraying none of the stiffness of a man who'd spent too long in the saddle. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low, a rumble like distant thunder, roughened by a lack of use. "Saw the fresh earth. Figured you might be needin' a hand, mendin' fence, choppin' wood." Lark straightened, driving the blade of the shovel into the ground beside the grave, a marker, for now. "I manage my own land, Mister." He gave a slow nod, his eyes taking in the small ranch house, the sturdy barn, the empty corrals, and the solitary woman. "Not looking for charity, just work, day labor. My horse needs a stall and a meal. I need the same. I'm handy." She studied him. He wasn't a drifter. Not quite. He was worn, but not broken. His eyes, now that he was closer, were the color of a gunmetal sky, and they were perceptive, too perceptive. He looked at her, and she felt he wasn't just seeing a widow in a black shawl. He was seeing the exhaustion and the fury beneath it. "I hire hands, Mr. Shaw," Calder Shaw. "I hire hands, Mr. Shaw," she said, her voice flat and cold as creek stone. "Not hearts. Mine's not available for hire, and it's not in need of mending. Barn's empty. You can take a stall. There's feed in the bin. Fence line by the south pasture took a hit last week. You can start there in the morning. I pay 50 cents a day and keep." "Fair enough," Calder said. He didn't smile. He didn't offer condolences. He just met her gaze. "But you're wrong about one thing, ma'am." Lark bristled. "Oh, I saw the tracks of salt on your face. Dried now, but they were there." He tipped his hat. "I'll see to my horse." Lark watched him walk away. Leading the bay. He was right. She had cried, hours ago, in the pre-dawn dark, but the cold wind had dried the evidence. She hated that he'd seen it. She had just turned to go back to the house when 2 more riders appeared. These men were different. They rode new horses, and their saddles were oiled. They worked for the railroad. They pulled up, not bothering with the politeness Calder had shown. "Mrs. Ellison," the thicker of the 2 men said, not bothering to remove his hat. "Mr. Vaughn Pike sends his regards on your loss." Lark said nothing. "He also wanted us to inquire," the man continued, pulling a folded paper from his pocket, "about the status of the water rights for Juniper Hollow, specifically the Copper Willow Spring. Mr. Pike had an agreement sketched out with your husband." "Get off my land," Lark said, her voice lethally quiet. The man raised an eyebrow. "Now, ma'am, it's just business. The Transcontinental needs that water for the new boiler station. Mr. Pike is prepared to be generous." "Now," Lark said, taking a step toward them. The man's partner, younger and smarter, put a hand on his arm. "Jed, not today. Look at her." Jed spat a stream of tobacco juice, missing her porch by inches. "Fine, but Mr. Pike will be by. He expects an answer by week's end." They wheeled their horses and galloped off, their arrogance churning up the dust. Lark stood shaking, the implication hitting her. An agreement Peter had told her he'd refused Pike's offer. She didn't have to wait long. An hour later, as she was washing the grit from her face in the kitchen basin, a smart, black buggy rolled into her yard. Vaughn Pike stepped out. He was a man who didn't belong in the basin. He wore a tailored wool suit despite the dust, and his boots were polished. He smelled of bay rum and expensive cigars, a scent that soured the clean, dry air. He moved with an unsettling, predatory grace, a politician's smile fixed on his face. He removed his derby hat as he approached the porch. "Mrs. Ellison, Lark, my deepest condolences," he said, his voice as smooth and oily as his hair. "Peter was a fine man, a pillar of this community." Lark wiped her hands on her apron, her face a mask of cold stone. Pike walked past her, his audacity astounding. He went to the fresh grave, stood over it for a moment as if in prayer, and then produced a single, perfect white rose where had he even gotten it and laid it on the raw dirt. "A tragedy," he murmured, turning back to her. "A terrible, terrible accident, which of course leaves you in a delicate position, a woman alone, with all this." He gestured to the ranch. "Juniper Hollow is a fine property, but the water, the Copper Willow Spring, is its true jewel, as you know. I had a preliminary agreement with Peter." "There was no agreement," Lark said. "He turned you down, flat." Pike's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He was reconsidering. "I assure you, I am prepared to offer you $500, cash, for the rights, a generous sum, enough to see you set up comfortably back east. Perhaps the spring isn't for sale, Mr. Pike. Not for 500, not for 5,000. Be reasonable." "Lark," he said, his tone hardening. "The railroad is coming. That is progress. That is inevitable. You cannot stand in the way of it." "Watch me," she said. Pike's eyes narrowed. He replaced his hat. his veneer of sympathy vanishing. "You'll find grief makes bad decisions. Mrs. Ellison, I'll be in touch." He climbed back into his buggy and was gone, leaving only the smell of his cigar and the obscene white rose on her husband's grave. She was still standing there, vibrating with a rage that felt like it would split her skin. When the last visitor of the day arrived, Sheriff Bram Kelleher. Bram was a big man, running to fat, his badge pinned crookedly on a stained vest. He smelled of whiskey and stale tobacco. He ambled up the porch steps, notebook in hand. "Lark, a terrible day. Terrible." He didn't look at the grave. He didn't look at her. He looked at his notebook. "Just need to dot the I's. For the report. Keep it clean for the county judge. We're all in agreement. Tragic accident. Peter spooked the herd. They went over the notch." He wasn't asking her. He was telling her. "Bram," she said, her voice tight. "The tracks." "Tracks," he said, too quickly. "Stampede. Lark. Ground's all chewed up. Can't make heads or tails of it. Just a tragedy." He licked his pencil. "Now, Vaughn Pike spoke to me in town. He's worried about you. That's a good man. Lark. His offer for the Copper Willow Spring, it's more than fair. Stands at $500. That's a lot of money for a woman alone. Probably smart to take it. Settle this business. Move on." Lark's gaze, sharp as a hawk's, wasn't on his face. It was on his boots. He'd polished them. She could see that. He always tried to look official when he was doing Pike's business, but he'd missed a spot, tucked deep in the groove of his left heel. There was a clot of mud. It wasn't the gray alkali dust of the main road or the dark loam of her own yard. It was a thick, sticky, rust-red clay. Her blood went cold. There was only one place in Last Light Basin with mud that color. The red notch. The exact spot where Peter had gone over. She slowly lifted her eyes to meet his. He was watching her, a nervous sweat on his upper lip. He knew what she was thinking. Lark said nothing. She let the silence stretch. Let him stew in it. Finally, she just nodded. "I'll think on it. Sheriff, I'm very tired." Relief washed over Bram's face. He snapped his notebook shut. "That's smart. Lark, that's a good girl. You rest now. You'll see sense in the morning." He practically bolted for his horse, leaving Lark alone on the porch. The red clay of his boot seared into her memory. The sun bled out of the sky, leaving the basin in a deep, star-pricked indigo. The cold returned, sharper this time. Lark hadn't moved inside. She sat on the top step of the porch, the black shawl wrapped tight. The wedding shovel rested against the railing next to her. It was no longer a tool of planting or burial. It was a weapon. She was standing watch. A soft light bobbed in the darkness. It was Calder Shaw, walking from the barn. He carried a lantern, its glass clean, its light a warm, steady circle. He didn't come onto the porch. He didn't crowd her space. He simply set the lantern down on the bottom step, casting a pool of light that reached her boots. It was an offering. A small, silent circle of warmth in the vast, cold dark. He nodded once, a silent good night, and began to turn back toward the barn. He had respected the line she had drawn. His silence, his respect for her boundary after a day of men trying to push, pry, and intimidate her, broke something in her. It was the first act of decency she'd felt all day that didn't ask for something in return. "Mr. Shaw." He stopped, turned back. He was just a shape in the dark, standing outside the light's small ring. "Ma'am." Her voice was low, trembling for the first time. Not with grief, not with fear, but with the terrible, heavy weight of the truth. "The town sheriff Kelleher, Mr. Pike, they all say it was a stampede, a tragic accident." Calder waited. The silence of the basin pressed in, vast and listening. "He didn't fall," she whispered, the words tearing out of her, raw and dangerous. "He was pushed. I saw the tracks. I found the cut rein." She looked away from him, toward the light of the lantern, her hands twisting in her lap. "If I told you my husband was murdered, would you believe me?" Calder's jaw did not move for perhaps 3 long heartbeats. The only sound in the vast, cold dark was the hiss of the lantern and the distant, lonely call of a coyote. He stood just outside the ring of light, a shadow defined by the glow. Lark hadn't realized she was holding her breath, waiting for the laugh, the dismissal, the patronizing, "Now, ma'am, you're just grieving." Instead, he took 2 slow steps forward, bringing his face into the warm light. His features were weathered, carved by wind and sun, and his eyes, that startling gunmetal gray, held no pity. They held something far more valuable attention. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and even. "In my line of work, I've learned one thing. The official story is usually just the one that's easiest to write down. The truth is almost always harder and uglier." He looked at the fresh mound of earth, then back to her. "You said you found the cut rein." Yes, I kept it. Show me." Lark's breath hitched. It was the first time she had been believed, the first time the crushing weight on her chest had eased, if only by an ounce. She stood, her joints stiff from the cold, and led the way to the small tack shed next to the barn. The air inside was heavy with the familiar, comforting smells of leather, horse sweat, and hay. Peter's smells. It was almost suffocating. She lit a small lantern, her hand shaking, and pulled the piece of tack from a nail where she'd hidden it. It was the end of Peter's best leather rein, the part that connected to the bit. Calder took it from her. He didn't just look at it, he examined it. He turned it over under the light, his calloused thumb rubbing the cut edge. "You were right," he said. "This wasn't broke. This was cut." He held it closer to the light. "See here, no stress marks, no fraying where the leather would stretch before it gave. It's a flat, clean slice, done with a very sharp blade, probably a new boot knife. One pass. Quick!" He handed it back to her, his gaze locking with hers. "You ride a spooked horse, you pull back. If that rein snaps, it tears. This was done to make sure he had no control before he even knew he was in trouble. No, Mrs. Ellison, this wasn't a stampede. This was an execution." The word hung in the cold, dusty air. Execution. It was the truth she had known in her bones, now given voice. "The tracks," she said, her voice stronger. "The men who came for me, their tracks. They were strange, not like ours. The horseshoes, they had a hook on the heel, a deep one." Calder frowned, his mind clearly working. "A hooked shoe. That ain't a rancher's shoe. We ride for grip, but that's different. That's a logger's shoe, or something custom, heavy, built to tear up ground, maybe pull, or what? Or to brace." He said, "To brace hard, turn fast, and drive something. Like a herd." He rubbed his jaw. "There's only one smith this side of the divide who does that kind of custom work. Man named Zeke Hart, runs the forge in Gray Butte. He's an artist with iron, and he don't ask questions if the coin is good." Lark felt a jolt. Gray Butte, that's where Pike's railroad crew was based. A new, cold resolve settled over her. This wasn't just grief anymore. This was a hunt. The next day passed in a blur of numb activity. Calder rose before the sun, as she knew he would. He didn't speak of the night before. He simply drank the coffee she left on the stove, took a biscuit, and went to the south pasture to mend the fence, just as he'd been hired to do. His presence was a quiet, solid thing. He was doing his job. Giving her the space to do her job, today, was to go through Peter's things. It was a task she had dreaded, a finality she wasn't ready for. But now, it wasn't about mourning. It was about searching. She opened his pine chest at the foot of their bed. The scent of his wool shirt and tobacco hit her. A fresh wave of loss. She pushed it down. Look, think. What did Bram and Pike miss? She went through his ledgers. Nothing. Just cattle counts, feed prices, notes on the drought. She looked through his desk. Receipts. Old letters from his brother back in Ohio. Then, in the bottom drawer, tucked beneath his winter woolens, she found it, a small tin music box. It had been his mother's. It was cheap, painted with faded roses, and the latch was broken. He'd always meant to fix it. She ran her thumb over the lid. Why would he hide this? She used her pocket knife to pry the bent latch open. The tiny metal cylinder inside was still, but tucked into the empty space where the mechanism should be. There was a small, tightly folded piece of paper. It was torn from a payment ledger. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it. It wasn't a letter. It was a simple, cryptic notation, written in Peter's familiar, heavy hand, GS17, CW Spring, CW Spring. That was Copper Willow Spring. Her spring. But GS17. It meant nothing to her. She looked at it for a long time, turning it over, willing it to make sense. It was a clue. Peter had hidden it. It mattered. She was still staring at it when a wagon rattled into the yard. Lark tensed, her hand instinctively going to the shovel handle, which she now kept leaning by the door. But it wasn't Pike's buggy. It was Ora Finch's buckboard. Ora, the basin's midwife and healer, was a woman in her late 50s, with kind eyes and hands as tough and capable as Lark's own. She climbed down, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. "Lark, child," she said, enveloping her in a hug that smelled of sage and strong soap. Lark hadn't realized how badly she'd needed that. "I heard you did the burying yourself. You should not have had to bear that alone." "I wasn't alone," Lark said, surprising herself. "I am managing." Ora gave her a knowing look. "Managing is one thing. Living is another." She held out the bundle. "I brought you this. It was your mother's. I've kept it for you." Lark unwrapped it. Inside was a shawl, but not a black, heavy shroud of mourning. It was a beautiful, soft wool, the color of apricot blossoms in the spring sun, a color of life. "I have worn black long enough," Lark said, her voice thick. "That you have," Ora said softly. "You put that on, to remember who you are, child. You are your mother's daughter, and you are the iron of this basin. Don't let them make you forget that. Not Pike, not that whiskey-soaked coward Bram Kelleher." The name snapped Lark back to the present. "Ora, do you know anything about Pike's business, about how he pays his men?" Ora settled into the rocker, her gaze sharpening. "I know he flashed a lot of railroad money when he first arrived, but lately the men grumble. They're paid in scrip, vouchers. Good, they say, at the general store, or at the dusty Laurel Saloon." She leaned in. "But it's a cheat. Pike owns half the saloon now. He pays them in scrip, and they give it right back to him for watered-down whiskey with a fake tax stamp on it. It's a closed loop, and he's the only one getting rich." Lark's heart hammered. She held out the small piece of paper. "What does GS17 mean to you?" Ora squinted at it. "GS General Scrip, maybe like the vouchers. And 17, that could be a voucher number, or a line item." Peter was a careful man. He was tracking something, CW Spring. He was tracking Pike's payments related to your spring. The picture was forming, ugly and sharp. Pike wasn't just trying to buy the spring, he was paying for it, in scrip, to someone. GS17. That night, the ranch felt different. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a fortress. Calder had finished the south fence and was now reinforcing the hinges on the barn door. He'd accepted Lark's offer of a meal in the kitchen, a silent acknowledgement that their relationship had shifted from employer and hired hand to something else. Allies. They ate in silence, the air thick with unspoken plans. Hours later, Lark was jolted from a light, restless sleep. It wasn't a loud noise. It was the absence of one. The usual night sounds, the crickets, the shifting of the cattle had stopped. She sat up, her heart pounding. Crack! The sound of a single rifle shot split the night, deafeningly loud, echoing off the basin walls. It came from the barn. Lark grabbed the heavy shotgun she kept by her bed, her hands steady, and ran to the window. In the pale moonlight, she saw a shadow detach itself from the corner of her house. A man, dressed in dark clothes. He scrambled, vaulting the corral fence with an agile, practiced ease. She heard Calder's voice yell from the barn. "Run, and the next one won't be high." The shadow didn't look back. He hit the ground running and disappeared into the sagebrush. Lark ran onto the porch, the shotgun still raised, her heart hammering against her ribs. Calder walked out of the barn, his rifle held loosely in one hand. "He was at your window," Calder said, his voice grim. Then he moved to the cattle pen. He wasn't trying to steal a cow. He was looking, testing. You missed him?" "I wasn't aiming at him," Calder said. A warning, but he was clumsy in his hurry. He fell at the fence line. He walked over to the spot where the man had vaulted the fence. He knelt, scanning the ground. "Ah." He stood up, holding something. It glinted in the moonlight. It was a knife, not a big skinning knife, but a slender, wicked-looking blade, perfectly balanced. The handle was dark bone. Lark came closer. Carved into the bone pommel, in neat block letters, was a single word: Sutter. Calder's face went rigid. He knew the name. She could see it. "Gideon Sutter," he said, his voice flat and cold as a tombstone. "I'd heard he was working for the Transcontinental Line. He's not just muscle. He's a fixer. Used to be with the Pinkertons, till they kicked him out for being too thorough." He looked at Lark, his eyes dark. "If Pike has hired Gideon Sutter, this is more dangerous than we thought. Sutter doesn't just scare people. Mrs. Ellison, he finishes things." A new, icy fear, colder than the night air, touched Lark, but then came the rage, hot and cleansing. "Another piece," she said. "What?" "The sheriff, Bram Kelleher. When he came here yesterday, to tell me it was an accident, he had mud on his boot." Calder frowned. "This whole basin is mud and dust." "No," Lark said, her mind racing, connecting the dots. "It was red mud, thick, like clay, from the red notch, from where he went over." Calder was silent for a moment. "Are you sure?" "Wait here." She ran back inside, to the woodshed where she'd put Peter's clothes. She grabbed the canvas trousers he'd been wearing when she found him. She brought them out to the porch, holding them under the lantern light. The knees and cuffs were caked in it, the same thick, sticky, rust-colored clay. "Bram told me the ground was all chewed up," Lark said, her voice shaking with suppressed fury. "He said he couldn't make heads or tails of the tracks. He was lying. He knew exactly what the ground was like at the Red Notch. He knew Calder because he was there." The kitchen table was no longer for eating. It was a war room. Calder spread his own worn survey map of the basin on the table. The lantern cast flickering shadows on the topography. Lark placed the items, one by one, like pieces on a game board. The cut rein, the tin music box, the ledger scrap, GS-17, CW spring, the Sutter knife. "All right," Calder said, tapping the map. "Here is Juniper Hollow. Here." He traced a blue line with his finger. "Is the Copper Willow Spring? The motive." He tapped a small square labeled Gray Butte. "This is where Zeke Hart has his forge, where the hooked horseshoes were likely made." He moved his finger again, to a jagged line on the map. "And here, the Red Notch, where Peter died, and where Sheriff Bram Kelleher left his footprints." Lark went to her sewing basket and pulled out a spool of red thread. She didn't ask. She just did it. She handed it to Calder. He took it, nodding slowly. He laid the thread down, a stark, crimson line. It connected Gray Butte to the Red Notch. He laid another piece, connecting the Red Notch to the Copper Willow Spring. It was all there. The conspiracy, laid bare on her kitchen table. Lark looked at the map, at the pieces of her husband's murder. Then she walked to the corner and picked up the wedding shovel. Its wooden handle was smooth in her hands. She brought it to the table and laid it down, parallel to the red thread. The carved initials P+L glowed in the light, the symbol of their love, the tool of his burial. Now, it was something else, a challenge. "Tomorrow," Calder said, his voice quiet, decisive. "We start in Gray Butte. We go to see Zeke Hart." Lark looked at the shovel, at the map, and then at the man standing opposite her. A stranger, 2 days ago. Now, The only person on earth she trusted. Her eyes were dry, clear, and as hard as the iron blade of the shovel. "They think because I'm a widow, I'm weak," she said, her voice low. "They think I'll sell. They think I'll run." She placed her hand flat on the map, covering the red thread. "I'm not running anymore." Gray Butte was not a town. It was a wound, a long, muddy scar carved into the basin floor, following the raw path of the new railroad line. It smelled of coal smoke, green lumber, and hot iron. The air, unlike the clean, high-country wind at Juniper Hollow, was thick and tasted of soot. At the end of the main street, a plume of black smoke identified their destination, Zeke Hart's forge. The sound hit them before the heat a rhythmic, deafening clang hisses clang that was the heartbeat of the railroad's advance. They found Zeke Hart pounding a strip of glowing iron. He was a mountain of a man, with arms like fence posts and a leather apron that had seen better decades. Sweat carved clean rivers through the soot on his face. He didn't stop, just glanced at them, his eyes red-rimmed from the fire. "Wait your turn. This is for the line." Calder Shaw stepped forward, into the blistering heat of the forge. He didn't raise his voice over the hammer. He waited for the man to pause, to quench the iron in a steaming barrel. In the sudden, ringing silence, Calder spoke. "We're not here for a repair. We're here about a set of custom shoes you made." Zeke eyed them, his guard instantly up. In a town like Gray Butte, questions meant trouble. "I make 100 kinds of shoes. Mister." Calder bent down, with one finger. He drew a shape in the hard-packed dirt floor, a horseshoe, but with a distinct, curved hook at the heel. Zeke's eyes narrowed. He looked at Lark, standing in the doorway, her black shawl traded for the apricot-colored one, her wedding shovel held loosely in one hand. She looked like a specter of judgment. "Aye," Zeke said, his voice a low rumble. "I know the make. That's my own design, for loggers, mostly, to grip wet wood. Ain't made a set like that in, a year." "You made a dozen sets 3 weeks ago," Lark said. Her voice was flat, carrying clearly over the hiss of the forge. Zeke's head snapped back to her. He gripped his hammer, his knuckles white. "Who are you to say?" "I'm Peter Ellison's wife," she said. The name dropped into the forge like a chunk of cold iron. Zeke's face changed. He was a basin man, under all the railroad soot. He'd known Peter. "Vaughn Pike," he growled, the name tasting like ash. "He ordered 'em, said they was special rigging, for his new security team." "His security team," Calder repeated, his voice devoid of inflection. "What did he say they were for?" Zeke looked away, back at his anvil. "Said he needed 'em for problem clearing. Said his men needed to get a grip on rough stock. Paid in railroad scrip. Good coin. I didn't ask more." "Did he give you a voucher number?" Lark asked, her heart pounding. "Aye, a scrip note. General scrip, GS." Zeke squinted, trying to remember. Calder held out the small, folded piece of paper from the music box. "GS 17, CW Spring." Zeke's eyes widened. He strode to a messy desk piled with invoices and greasy ledgers. He flipped through a book, his thumb leaving black smudges on the pages. He stopped. He tapped the page. "That's it," he breathed, a look of dawning, sick realization on his face. "General scrip, voucher 17. Full payment, 12 sets, hooked shoes. Delivered to Vaughn Pike's office. He said they'd make the job quick." Calder and Lark locked eyes. It was done. The link was forged, solid as the iron on Zeke's anvil. The shoes used to murder Peter were custom-made for Pike, and Peter had known the payment code. He'd known, and he'd hidden it. "He used him to drive the stampede," Calder said, not as a question, but as a statement. Zeke looked at the drawing in the dust. "Drive, mister, with those hooks. You wouldn't just drive a herd, you'd tear it. You'd rip up the ground, brace, and turn a herd on a dime. You could start a stampede from a standstill. God help anyone in the way." Zeke Hart slammed his heavy fist onto the anvil. He used my iron. That murdering, he used my iron. He's not done. Mr. Hart, Lark said. He wants my water. The Copper Willow Spring. That's what CW Spring means. Then you'd best be careful, Zeke said, his voice low. Pike's got this whole town in his pocket. Him and that snake Sutter he brought in from the east. We need a copy of that invoice. Zeke. Calder said, Proof. Zeke hesitated, looking toward the street. If Pike hears He'll hear we talked anyway, Lark said. The question is, do you want Peter's death to mean something? Or do you want to keep shoeing Pike's horses until he owns your forge, too? Zeke stared at her, then gave a sharp, grim nod. He tore the page from the ledger. Take it. And take this. He rummaged on the desk and tossed Calder a folded paper. That's Pike's IOU for the last job. He's been paying slow. He owes me money. That's why Bram Kelleher's been advising me to be patient. The leverage. Pike owned the law, but he was careless with his debts. They left the forge and stepped back into the muddy street. The sun was past noon, and the town was coming alive. Thirsty railroad workers and sullen-looking men with guns on their hips were drifting toward the largest building on the street, the dusty Laurel Saloon. We need to listen, Calder said. Listen, we have the proof, Lark said, clutching the invoice. We have pieces. We need to know what they're saying, what the town believes. The saloon was a wall of noise. It stank of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and the sharp tang of cheap whiskey. Sawdust coated the floor, soaking up spills. A tinny piano was being badly played in the corner. They took a small table in the back, Calder facing the door. He ordered a coffee. Lark asked for water. The men at the next table were loud, their voices slurring. Told ya, Pike's not messing around. He's got the boiler station surveyed. On her land on the Ellison place. Right on top of it, that Copper Willow Spring. The engines need 30,000 gallons a day. Pike's gonna get it. What about the widow she's holding out? A harsh laugh. For how long? A woman alone? Sutter's paying $5 a day for security. I signed on. Easy money. She'll be gone by week's end. Sell up or have another accident. Lark's hand tightened on her water glass. Her blood ran cold, then hot. So, it was common knowledge. The whole town was just waiting for her to fail. The saloon doors swung open, casting a long, bright rectangle of dust into the dim room. The noise level dipped. Sheriff Bram Kelleher walked in. He wasn't there to drink. His eyes scanned the room, bypassing Lark and Calder as if they were invisible. He spotted Zeke Hart, who had just come in for his midday beer. Bram ambled over to the blacksmith. He put a heavy, familiar hand on Zeke's shoulder, leaning in close. The saloon was quiet enough now that they could hear the sheriff's low, threatening rumble. Zeke, good to see you. Just wanted to remind you, you're a blacksmith. You hammer iron. You don't hammer out stories. A man who talks too much in this town, he might find his forge has a fire. A bad one. You understand me? Zeke Hart was a giant, but he visibly shrank under the lawman's hand. He stared into his beer, his face rigid. He didn't look at Bram. He just looked at his own massive hands, resting on the bar, then flicked his gaze to the heavy forge hammer he'd leaned against the wall. He said nothing. Bram clapped him on the back, a gesture that held no warmth. Good man. Knew you'd see sense. As Bram turned away, pleased with himself, Zeke caught Calder's eye across the room. The blacksmith's face was a mask of fury and shame. The doors swung open again. If Bram's entrance had lowered the noise, this one killed it. Gideon Sutter stepped inside. He was immaculate. He wore a dark, tailored suit, a silk vest, and a bowler hat. He looked like a banker or an undertaker. He smiled, a polite, thin-lipped expression that didn't touch his pale, cold eyes. He scanned the room, his gaze sliding over the roughnecks, over Bram, and landing, with unsettling precision, on Lark. His smile widened. He walked toward their table, ignoring the sheriff completely. He moved with a snake's oily grace. He stopped at their table, removed his hat. Mrs. Ellison, he said, his voice educated, smooth as polished stone. "A profound pleasure. Gideon Sutter, I am an associate of Mr. Pike's. He is deeply concerned for your welfare." Lark said nothing. "It must be a terrible burden." Sutter continued, his eyes roving over her. "Managing such a large property alone. The nights must be so very quiet, so empty. I trust you are finding comfort in your time of grief." The insinuation was vile, a greasy thumb pressing on the bruise of her loss. Calder didn't say a word. He didn't reach for his gun. He simply stood up. His movement was slow, deliberate, and final. He moved to stand directly between Sutter and Lark, a solid, unmoving wall. He was taller than Sutter, broader. The space between them shrank to a single breath. Calder didn't look angry. He just looked present, a fact. Sutter's smile tightened at the edges. He had been testing her defenses, and this silent, weathered man was the answer. "Mr. Shaw, is it?" Sutter said, his voice losing some of its silk. "The new hired hand, Mr. Pike believes in paying for good help. Perhaps you are underemployed." Before Calder could answer, Lark stood up. She wasn't hiding behind him. She walked past him, dragging something from the floor. Clang. The sound of iron hitting the bar top echoed through the dead silent saloon. Lark had planted her wedding shovel on the polished wood. Every eye in the room, drinker, card player, sheriff, fixer was on her. "You all want to talk about my property," Lark said, her voice clear and carrying, shaking not with fear, but with a cold, focused rage. "You want to talk about my comfort. Let's talk about my husband." She looked at the fly-specked clock behind the bar. 4 days ago, at 10 o'clock in the morning, Peter Ellison was at the Red Notch. At 10:05, 2 riders men hired by Vaughn Pike wore down his horse using custom-made hooked horseshoes. Shoes forged by Mr. Hart, right here, and paid for with voucher GS17. Zeke Hart, at the bar, nodded once. A murmur went through the crowd. "They cut his reins," Lark continued, her voice rising, "and drove his own herd over him." She turned, her gaze landing like a physical blow on Sheriff Kelleher, who had gone pale. And at 11:30, she boomed. Sheriff Bram Kelleher was at the Red Notch, not investigating, contaminating, covering those hook tracks with his own boot prints. He did such a good job he forgot to wipe the red mud off his boots before he came to my house to tell me it was a tragic accident. The silence was absolute, heavier than stone. It was all out, the accusation, the proof, the betrayal. Gideon Sutter was the first to break it. He laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was dry, like leaves scraping on a grave. "My dear brave woman," he said, stepping around Calder, "that is a remarkable story. But justice isn't found in the mud. Justice is a commodity. Like pork bellies or steel rails, it is bought and sold by the pound. And here in Grey Butte, Mr. Pike owns the scales." Calder turned his head, his eyes locking with Sutter's. "Maybe where you come from," Calder said, his voice flat. "Here, we measure it by boot prints." That was the spark. One of Pike's men at a front table, the one who had bragged about his $5-a-day job, jumped to his feet. "Shut that widow up!" He grabbed a half-empty whiskey bottle and hurled it. Time seemed to slow. The bottle spun end over end, whistling past Lark's head to shatter against the back bar mirror. Glass exploded. The saloon erupted, but it wasn't a brawl. It was an attack. 3 of Pike's security men moved at once, a coordinated assault. One lunged at Calder. Calder didn't draw. He didn't even punch. He met the man's charge, stepping into it, grabbing the man's wrist and shoulder. He used the man's own momentum, pivoting and throwing him clean over the table. The man landed in a heap. The wind knocked out of him. A second man, seeing his chance, pulled a long knife and rushed Lark. "I'll give you comfort, widow." Lark didn't scream. She didn't retreat. She hefted the shovel. She swung it, a short, powerful arc, not with the blade, but with the heavy, flat steel back of it. Thwack! The sound was sickening, a dull crack of metal on bone. The shovel connected perfectly with the man's outstretched wrist. He screamed. a high, thin sound as the knife clattered to the floor. He crumpled, clutching his shattered arm. She didn't hit him again. The one blow was enough. The third man, seeing his companions downed in seconds, hesitated. That was all Calder needed. He closed the distance in one step. A short, hard strike to the man's elbow. The man's gun, half drawn, fell from numb fingers. "That's enough," Sheriff Bram finally roared. Drawing his own pistol, "All of you, stop it." But he wasn't arresting Pike's men. He grabbed the two disabled men, the one clutching his wrist, the one gasping for air. "You two get out of here, now before I run you in." He was letting them go. Sutter hadn't moved an inch. He had watched the entire 3-second fight with a look of cold, professional appraisal. As his men scrambled for the door, he gave a tiny, approving nod to Calder. Then he looked at Lark. He put his bowler hat back on. "A spirited defense, Mrs. Ellison, most impressive." Lark watched him turn. Just before he walked out, Sutter made a small, tight gesture with his left hand to Sheriff Bram. A brush of the fingers. "Clean it up." Bram, his face red and sweating, turned on Lark. See what you've done, inciting a riot, disturbing the peace, you and this vagrant. You best get back to Juniper Hollow. Lark, before you find yourself in real trouble." "It's already here, Sheriff," Lark said. She picked up her shovel, resting it on her shoulder. They walked out of the saloon, leaving a dead silent crowd, a broken mirror, and a disgraced lawman. They mounted their horses and rode out of Grey Butte, the sounds of the forge fading behind them. They rode in silence for a good 10 minutes, the tension slowly easing from Lark's shoulders. "That was a mistake," Calder said, his voice quiet. Lark's head snapped toward him. "What, defending myself?" "Telling the truth, no," he said, looking not at her, but at the trail ahead. "Showing our hand, we showed them we have the voucher. We showed them we have Zeke. We showed them we know the timeline. We backed Pike and Sutter into a corner. And men like that, they don't talk their way out of a corner. They burn their way out." "What does that mean?" Calder finally looked at her, his gray eyes cold with certainty. "It means they can't let us, or Zeke, or that invoice exist. They have to destroy the evidence. All of it." He looked up at the sky, a vast, clear blue, and then toward her ranch. "They'll burn the barn tonight." Lark felt a cold fist close around her heart. The barn, the hay, her cattle, her home. She spurred her horse into a trot. "Then let's make sure we're ready for them," she said, her voice hard as iron. "Let's see who stands closest to the fire." They did not ride for the ranch house. The words Calder had spoken in Grey Butte. "They'll burn the barn tonight" hung between them, a cold, sharp blade of certainty. The confrontation at the saloon had been a declaration of war. Pike and Sutter would not wait. They would answer, and their answer would be fire. But Calder, leading his bay, did not take the low road to the barn. He angled up, toward the high pasture, toward the grove of trees that marked the head of the spring. Lark followed without question. The air was cooling as the sun dipped toward the jagged western peaks, and the ride from town had coated them in a fine layer of alkali dust and the sour, lingering smell of the saloon. Copper Willow Spring was another world. After the raw, muddy wound of Grey Butte, it felt like a church. Here, the grass was green, kept alive by the steady, generous flow of water. The willows that gave the spring its name drooped, their leaves a pale, silvery green, whispering in the same breeze that had felt so hostile in the basin. The only sound was the musical gurgle of water pushing up from the earth, clear and impossibly cold, before it began its run down the ravine to feed her land. This was the heart of Juniper Hollow. This was the lifeblood. This was what Peter had died for. They dismounted, letting the horses drink deeply from the trough Peter had carved from a massive pine log. Calder moved to the head of the spring itself, kneeling on the flat stones. He cupped his hands and drank, then splashed the icy water onto his face, scrubbing at the grime. Lark watched him. He had taken the brunt of the attack, his body shielding hers. There was a smear of dark soot, or perhaps just grimy dirt from the saloon floor, high on his cheekbone, just under his eye. He had missed it. She walked to him, her footsteps silent on the damp earth. She unhooked her canteen, but she didn't drink. Instead, she took the clean handkerchief from her pocket and dipped it into the pulsing heart of the spring. The water was so cold it made her fingers ache. She knelt beside him. He had his eyes closed, his face turned up to the cooling air. "You missed a spot," she whispered. His eyes snapped open. He didn't move as she lifted her hand, the damp cloth held between her fingers. He watched her, his gaze intense, unblinking. He was a man accustomed to violence, to quick, hard movements. This slow, gentle advance was something foreign. He was perfectly still, giving her the choice, letting her close the distance. Her hand was shaking. This was the first time she had touched him with any kind of softness. Her fingers, chapped and rough, brushed his skin as she gently wiped the grime from his cheek. She worked slowly, her breathing seeming to fall into rhythm with the quiet pulse of the spring water beside them. She was just cleaning a smudge of dirt, but it felt profound. It was an act of care. When she was done, her hand lingered, the cloth resting on his face. Calder's hands, which had been resting on his knees, lifted, but he didn't touch her. He reached for the heavy, black morning shawl she still wore, the one she had pulled tight in the saloon. His fingers found the knot she had tied at her throat. His eyes asked the question, "Are you sure?" Lark held his gaze. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Permission. His movements were deft. He didn't pull or tear. He carefully worked the knot loose, his knuckles brushing the skin of her neck. The touch was light, almost accidental, but it sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. He unwrapped the heavy wool from her shoulders, freeing her from its weight. The black fabric, which had felt like armor in town, now felt like a shroud. He let it fall to the ground behind her. He didn't stop there. Her hair, which she had pinned up in a severe, practical bun, was coming loose. He reached behind her head, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle, and untied the leather thong that held it. Her heavy, dark hair, free of its constraints, tumbled down her back. Then he took the apricot-colored shawl, the one Aura had given her, the color of life, which she had tucked in her saddlebag, and he carefully, respectfully, tied her hair back with it at the nape of her neck. His fingers brushed her skin, warm and solid. It was a simple, practical act, keeping her hair out of her face, but it felt like an anointing. He was removing her mourning and replacing it with something else. "Better," he said, his voice a low rumble. I have to tell you something," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "Now that the defenses were down." "About Peter." "About what Sutter said." He waited, his face unreadable in the twilight. "Sutter, he said Pike had an agreement with Peter. He wasn't entirely lying." She saw a flicker in Calder's eyes, but he said nothing, just listened. "I found it, 2 days ago, tucked in his desk. A draft, a preliminary contract for the water rights, for Copper Willow Spring." The confession felt like pulling a splinter from her soul. "Lark. He signed it. Calder, he signed his name." She looked away, at the water, ashamed. "Peter was a good man. He was the kindest man I ever knew, but he was tired. The drought last year, it nearly broke us. We were a month from selling the herd for pennies. Pike came, he offered us $500. It must have felt like a fortune. So he signed it." She closed her eyes. "But he was a good man. He regretted it. He told me he'd turned Pike down. But he must have been trying to find a way to tell me he'd made a mistake. That's what the voucher meant. GS-17. He must have found out Pike was already paying people against the spring. Even with just a draft, he was gathering proof. He was going to back out." She looked at Calder, desperate for him to understand. That's what the fight at the Red Notch was. That's what the photograph must show. Peter, telling Pike the deal was off. He was going to tear the paper up, and Pike couldn't let him. It wasn't just losing the water. It was Peter knowing how he was cheating. Peter was going to expose him. So, he wasn't just murdered, Calder said softly, understanding it all. He was silenced. Yes, she whispered. The admission, the vulnerability, left her hollow. She wrapped her arms around her own waist, suddenly cold. I don't know how to do this, she said, her voice trembling. I've spent every day since he died just being angry, being hard. That shovel, it's felt more natural in my hands than a spoon. In the saloon when that man came at me, all I felt was ice. I've been frozen. Calder, I'm afraid I'm forgetting what it feels like to be anything else. She looked at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. It feels like if I let go, even for a second, I'll betray him. By being weak. It's not weakness, Lark, Calder said, his voice firm, but gentle. It's not a betrayal. It's living. And you're allowed to. He didn't move closer. He kept that small, respectful space between them. I'm not Peter. I'm not trying to replace him. I can't, but I'm here. I'm not asking for anything. There's no rush. There's no pressure. I am just here, right now. His words were a balm. He wasn't trying to fix her. He wasn't trying to possess her. He was just offering his presence. The tension in the air was thick. No longer the tension of a coming fight, but of a question hanging unanswered. The sun was gone, and the first stars were appearing in the deep purple sky. She took a small, shaky step forward. She lifted her hand, the one that had held the shovel, the one that had cleaned his face. She didn't touch his cheek. She placed her palm flat on his chest. Execute, hands on his chest. Under her hand, she felt his heart. It was steady, strong, a solid, living rhythm. She could feel the warmth of him through his shirt. She kept her hand there, just feeling. She was so tired, tired of being strong, tired of being the widow Ellison. She looked up at him, and then, slowly, she leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. Execute, Lark touches her forehead to Calder's. His breath was warm on her face. He smelled of leather and dust and the clean, cold water of her spring. He was so solid, an anchor in a world that had become a violent, swirling river. His hands, which had been at his sides, came up, but he didn't grab her. He just rested them lightly on her waist. A question, a support. He was letting her lead. He was letting her decide. His voice was a low rumble, barely louder than the spring. Execute. Want me to hold you? The simple question broke the dam. A single, hot tear escaped her. Then another. The cold, hard ice inside her was cracking. Her voice was a choked whisper. Execute. Will you still hold me if I fall apart? He didn't answer with words. Execute. He pulls her into an embrace. His arms, strong and sure, came around her, one hand spread wide across her back, pulling her tight against his chest. The other moved up to cradle the back of her head, his fingers tangling in the hair he had just unbound. It was not a gentle, hesitant hug. It was a solid, encompassing, protective embrace. It was the embrace of a man who was not afraid of her breaking. It was an embrace that said, "Go ahead, I've got you." And she did. A sob, the one she had choked down at the grave, the one she had beaten back with the shovel, tore from her throat. She buried her face in the rough cotton of his shirt and let go. Execute body language. She felt the steel rods that had been holding her upright for days finally dissolve. Her shoulders, which had been braced for a fight, dropped. Her hands, which had balled into fists against his chest, gripped his shirt. Then, slowly, agonizingly, unclenched. She wasn't fighting anymore. She was just holding on. He said nothing. He just held her. He tucked her head under his chin, shielding her from the night, from the world, from the men who were coming. He let her shake. He let the grief and the fear and the exhaustion pour out of her. He held her until the shaking subsided, until her breathing quieted into ragged, catching gasps. He loosened his hold, but only slightly, just enough to lean back and look at her face, tear-streaked and raw in the starlight. Execute a gentle, long kiss, not crossing the line. He lowered his head, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She didn't. His lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion, not the fiery, demanding kiss of a lover. It was a kiss of confirmation. It was warm. It was firm. It was impossibly gentle. It tasted of clean water and salt. It was a promise. I'm here. It ended as gently as it began. He rested his forehead against hers again. She was breathing fast. A new kind of breath. He looked at her, his gray eyes dark and searching, and this time she leaned in. Execute. The kiss continues, fast, slow, following the rhythm of consensual breath. This one was different. This one had the spark. It was deeper, a silent, mutual claiming. It was the fast, slow rhythm, a question and an answer, a shared breath in the dark. It was the heat she had been so afraid of, but it wasn't burning her. It was warming her. It was safe. When they finally broke, they were both breathing as if they'd run a mile. Execute. They rest their foreheads together. A sound bubbled up in her chest. It was fragile, watery, and completely unexpected. It was a laugh. Execute a small laugh. What? He murmured, a ghost of a smile on his own lips. She shook her head, tears still wet on her cheeks. Execute, I want to remember what it feels like to live, not just exist. He moved one hand to cup her face, his rough thumb wiping the last tear from her cheek. You are, Lark, he said, his voice thick. You are the most alive person I have ever known. Execute. The sky is full of stars. They stood there for a long moment, simply breathing together, anchored by the sound of the spring. The peace was total, the high country air pure and cold, but the night was not over. The threat was still there, down in the basin, at her home. He was the first to pull back, though he didn't let go completely. He nodded toward the horses, who were waiting patiently. We should go, he said, his voice back to its quiet, practical tone. They'll be coming soon. Lark nodded. The ice was gone, but in its place, a different kind of steel was setting. It was no longer the brittle, cold iron of vengeance. It was the warm, flexible, and far stronger steel of purpose. She was no longer just fighting for what was lost. She was fighting for what she had just found. She looked at the water, the source of it all, and then back at him. Execute. Tomorrow we see this through. Let them come tonight, she whispered, her voice steady now. Let them bring their fire, but tomorrow, Calder. She met his gaze, her own clear and certain. Tomorrow we see this through, all the way to the end. He held her gaze for a long second, then gave a single, solid nod. To the end. The ride back from Copper Willow Spring was steeped in a new, profound silence. The intimacy they had shared, the confessions and the comfort, hung in the cool night air, a fragile, warm thing in a world that was still sharp and cold. They were no longer just allies, but the weight of what that meant, what it could mean, was a conversation for a different time. The time they had now was for war. They left the horses in the high pasture, hidden in a thicket of juniper, and approached the ranch house on foot, moving like shadows. He'll send more than one, Calder said, his voice a low rumble. All business. He won't use Sutter. Sutter's too clean. He'll use the men from the saloon, the ones who are clumsy, the ones who are expendable. So, we wait for them, Lark asked, her hand already reaching for the shotgun she'd left by the door. We don't wait, Calder said. We prepare. He didn't go for buckets of water. The barn, filled with 3 months of dry hay, would go up like a torch. Fighting it was a fool's errand. Instead, he went to his saddlebags and retrieved a spool of thin, strong wire. Then he went to the porch and, with surprising delicacy, began detaching the heavy cast-iron bell Lark used to call hands in for dinner. They'll come from the blind side, he said, moving with the economical grace she'd first seen. From the east, using the house to block the moonlight until they're right on top of the barn. He worked for 20 minutes. He rehung the bell, not on its post, but inside the kitchen, near the open window, suspended by a new wire. He ran that wire out the window, low to the ground, across the 30 yards of open space, and rigged it through a series of small, nearly invisible loops he nailed to the ground. He created a tripwire, barely 4 inches off the dirt, in the deepest shadow between the house and the barn door. "It won't stop them," he murmured, testing the tension. "But it'll tell us." They didn't light a lamp. They sat in the dark parlor, the open window letting in the cold night air. Lark held the shotgun, loaded with rock salt. Calder sat opposite her, his rifle across his lap. The wedding shovel, which she had brought in from the porch, leaned against the wall next to her. The hours ticked by. 1 o'clock, 2. The basin was so quiet she could hear the stamp of a horse in the high pasture. She must have dozed, her head nodding forward, because she was jolted awake by Calder's hand on her arm. "Smell that?" he whispered. "Smoke. Not wood smoke. It was the sharp, acidic smell of coal oil, kerosene, and then, before the first flicker of light, the night exploded. Jangle, 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 jangle. The wire, pulled taut, ripped the bell from its new mooring. It crashed to the kitchen floor with a deafening, metallic clatter. A frantic, screaming alarm. "Now!" Calder yelled. They burst onto the porch. 2 men, just as Calder had predicted. One was at the barn door, fumbling with a match. The other, the one who had tripped, was scrambling to his feet, a dark shape against the paler ground. "Fire!" Lark screamed, firing the shotgun into the air. The blast of the rock salt thundering through the basin. The man who had tripped recovered and ran, disappearing into the darkness. A panicked, clumsy retreat. The other man, startled and caught, threw his lit match onto the kerosene-soaked hay piled against the door. It didn't catch. It detonated. A whoosh that sounded like a giant's exhale, and the entire east wall of the barn was engulfed in a sheet of orange flame. "The calves!" Lark screamed. Not the main herd, which was safe in the north pasture, but the 3 new calves, born just last week, were in the birthing pen inside. Calder grabbed her arm. "Lark, no, it's too fast. I am not letting them burn." She ripped free from his grasp. She didn't run for the main door, which was now a wall of fire. She ran for the side hatch, the one that led to the pens. The heat was stunning, a physical blow that scorched her lungs. Smoke poured from the eaves, thick and black. The terrified, high-pitched bleating of the calves cut through the roar of the fire. She grabbed the heavy horse blanket soaking in the water trough, a precaution they had set before dark, and threw it over her head. She kicked open the hatch and plunged into the smoke. It was hell. Red light and black shadow. The air was unbreathable, filled with stinging embers. She found them, huddled in the farthest corner, their eyes wide with white terror. Come on," she choked, grabbing 2 of them. Pushing them toward the hatch, they scrambled out, bleating for their mothers. The 3rd one was trapped. A small stack of hay bales, already burning, had toppled over, blocking it in. "Lark, get out!" Calder was at the hatch, his face a mask of terror, a long pole hook in his hand. "I won't leave it," she yelled. She threw the sopping blanket over the small, burning barrier, hissing as the steam rose. She grabbed the calf, hoisting it in her arms. As she turned, a section of the hayloft above her gave way. A rain of burning hay and embers cascaded down. She cried out, shielding the calf with her body, but a burning piece of timber struck her arm. The pain was sharp, a searing line of fire. She ignored it, bursting out of the hatch, gasping, and shoving the calf toward Calder. "It's going!" Calder yelled, pointing with the hook. The main rafter. Through the smoke, they could see it. A massive pine beam, the central support for the hayloft, was glowing cherry red. If it fell, it would bring the entire roof down, destroying the main structure, the milking stalls, the forge, everything. "The water won't stop it," Calder said, his voice grim. "We have to pull it down. Now! Stand back!" He wedged the steel hook into a joint in the burning beam. He planted his feet, his muscles cording. "Lark, when it comes, be ready to move." He pulled. The beam groaned. It was built to last. Again. He repositioned, pulling with all his weight, The fire roared, a hungry beast. Crack! With a sound like a cannon shot, the rafter tore free. It fell in a volcanic explosion of sparks and cinders, crashing down into the hay, precisely where Calder had directed it. The hayloft was gone, a total loss, but the main walls and the rest of the roof, deprived of their burning support, held. It's standing, Lark breathed, clutching her burned arm. The loft is lost, Calder said, his chest heaving. But the barn is saved. They worked for another hour, dousing the remaining flames with water from the trough, isolating the fire, letting the worst of it burn itself out. By the time the sky began to turn a pale, sick gray, the fire was reduced to a smoldering, smoking ruin. The main barn was scarred, blackened, and open to the sky. But it stood. Lark sank onto the porch steps, her entire body shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. Her arm throbbed, a blistering red mark from wrist to elbow. Calder wasn't resting. He was walking the perimeter, his eyes on the ground. He went to the spot where the man had tripped. He knelt, scanning the dirt. He was clumsy, Calder said, and arrogant. He stood up and walked to her. He opened his hand. In his palm sat a small, silver lighter. It was heavy, expensive, and polished, strangely clean in the pre-dawn grime, and on its side, engraved in elegant, flowing script, were two initials, V.P. Von Pike, Lark whispered, the name tasting like poison. He's so sure of himself, he gives his toys to his thugs. A slow-riding horse, Sheriff Bram Kelleher. He ambled into the yard, not even bothering to look concerned. He looked annoyed. "Mornin', Lark," he called, not dismounting. "Heard a shotgun. Looked like you had a bit of a blaze. Everything all right?" "No, Sheriff, it is not," Lark said, her voice cold. "Two men, hired by Von Pike, just tried to burn my barn to the ground. They tried to murder my livestock." Bram sighed, a put-upon sound. He slowly dismounted, pulling out his notebook. "Now, Lark, that's a powerful accusation. Pike's men, you saw them in the dark." "One of them dropped this," Calder said, stepping forward, holding up the lighter. Bram's eyes widened, just for a second, then narrowed. He ignored Calder and looked at Lark. "This is getting to be a pattern. Lark, first that commotion in the saloon. Now this, folks are starting to talk. They're saying maybe this trouble just follows you. Or maybe," he gestured to the smoking barn, "maybe you had a still. A lot of folks try to hide their illegal spirits in the barn. They explode. Lark, all the time. Makes a fire just like this." The accusation was so vile, so backward. Lark was speechless. "I'm gonna have to search the premises," Bram said, suddenly official, stepping toward the house. "For the still? For the good of the county?" "No." Calder moved, blocking the steps. He was no longer the quiet hired hand. He was a solid wall. "You get out of my way, vagrant," Bram snarled, his hand dropping to his sidearm. "You are on private property." "Sheriff," Calder said, his voice calm, but with an edge of steel Lark hadn't heard before. "You are suggesting, without evidence, that Mrs. Ellison is a moonshiner. You are attempting to conduct a search without a warrant, based on nothing but your own bad imagination. You are not here to investigate an arson. You are here to intimidate a victim. You are obstructing justice. I am the law," Bram roared. "Then you should know it," Calder countered. "The Fourth Amendment. A person's home is secure against unreasonable search. You have no warrant. You have no probable cause. You have nothing. You try to set one boot on that porch. Sheriff, and I will be the one to file a report with the territorial marshal. Now, are you going to take Mrs. Ellison's report on the arson, or are you going to get on your horse and ride back to your real boss?" Bram stared at Calder. He was seeing him for the first time. Not a drifter, but someone who knew the rules, someone who was not afraid of him. Bram's face was purple. He sputtered, his hand on his gun, then off it. He knew he was beaten. "You've made a powerful enemy, Mrs. Ellison," he spat, his eyes full of venom. "A powerful enemy? He climbed back on his horse. "You'll be sorry for this," he said, and galloped away. As the sun cleared the horizon, 2 more visitors arrived. First, Ora Finch, her buckboard rattling. "I saw the smoke," she said, her face grim. She saw Lark's arm and clicked her tongue. "Come inside. Let me see that." She cleaned the burn, which was blistering, and applied a soothing, sharp-smelling salve. "This will sting, but it'll keep the infection out." As she wrapped it in clean linen, she looked at the silver lighter on the table. "So, he did it." "We can't prove he gave it to them," Lark said, wincing as Ora tied the bandage. "You don't need to," Ora said. "You just need to stack the kindling so high he can't climb out. The invoice, the lighter. What else?" "Peter's note," Lark said. "The hooked shoe, but we only have a drawing." "Put them all," Ora said, her voice firm. "In your mother's iron chest, the one she brought over the mountains. A fire won't take it, and a thieving sheriff can't break it. Keep the truth under iron, child." After Ora left, another visitor came. Zeke Hart. He came on foot, glancing over his shoulder, his face pale under the soot. I heard the blast. Then I saw the smoke," he stammered, holding a burlap-wrapped bundle. "Mrs. Ellison, this ain't right. What Pike did to Peter, what he tried to do to you." He thrust the bundle at her. I lied to Pike. I told him one of the shoes cracked in the quench, that I had to reforge it. I kept the cracked one for my collection." Lark unwrapped it. It was heavy. It was a single, black, hooked horseshoe, the physical proof. "And this," Zeke said, handing her a folded paper. "A clean copy of the invoice. From my ledger, GS-17. I'm going to take my wife to Copper Vale, to her sister's, for a visit. Pike, he's unhinged." He backed away. "God be with you. Mrs. Ellison, you're doing the right thing." The case was locking into place. The fire, meant to destroy her, had instead armed her. The news spread. Calder rode to the general store for supplies bandages, coffee, and grain for the horses. He returned 3 hours later. "It's all anyone's talking about," he reported, sitting across from her at the kitchen table. "Nobody believes the Still story. They all know what happened at the saloon. They're saying Pike has finally gone too far. They're scared of him. Lark, but for the first time, they're angry at him." "Good," Lark said. "Vaughn's already making his move," Calder said, his face grim. "He's not stupid. He's at the telegraph office. He's invited Reverend Davies from Copper Vale to come hold a public prayer service for you, for your terrible loss and your troubled mind. He's painting himself as the concerned neighbor." At that snake, Lark seethed. He was turning her into a charity case, a crazy widow. "And Sutter?" she asked. Calder's face hardened. "I took the high ridge back. I went by the spring. Sutter's not worried about prayer. He has 2 riflemen on the ridge above Copper Willow. They're not hiding. They're guarding it, like it's already his." Lark stood up. She walked to the window, looking at the smoking, blackened ruin of her hayloft. The sun was high now, shining on the destruction. The smell of wet ash was everywhere. She went to the wall and picked up the wedding shovel. She leaned on it, her bandaged arm resting on the handle. She thought of Peter, alone in the dark ground. She thought of the silver lighter in the iron chest. She thought of the black, hooked horseshoe. "He thinks he can burn me out. He thinks he can pray me into submission," she said, her voice quiet. She looked at the shovel, at the initials P+L carved into the wood. "The thing that buried my husband," she whispered, her voice no longer shaking, but resonating with the cold, hard clarity of iron. "We'll now dig up the truth. Grey Butte was not a town built for silence. The midday market break, however, came close. It was a half-hour truce declared by the sun, a window when the saws at the lumber mill went quiet and the forge cooled. The railroad office, a square, false-fronted building smelling of fresh pine and arrogance, was empty. Vaughn Pike was at the saloon, holding his public prayer meeting for the troubled widow. He had underestimated the widow. Lark stood in the narrow alley between the office and the assayers. the reins of her horse. Juniper, looped in one hand. She kept her other hand firmly on the horse's muzzle, her fingers stroking, her voice a low, constant murmur. Easy, girl, easy now. Just stand. The horse shifted, its iron shoes scraping the packed dirt, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet. Lark froze, her heart hammering. But the street remained empty. She watched the back door of the railroad office. Calder had disappeared through it 60 seconds ago. It felt like an hour. He had used a thin piece of steel, moving with a fast, unsettling competence that spoke of a past he'd never mentioned. He was inside for 3 minutes. Lark counted the ticks of the big clock in the telegraph office down the street. She heard a faint, metallic scrape from within. Then, a sharp, clean click. It was the sound of a safe tumbler falling into place. Suddenly, the door opened. Calder stepped out. Not fast, not slow. He carried a heavy leather-bound ledger under his arm. He gave a single nod. They didn't run, they walked, leading the horse, turning down the next alley, moving toward the livery. "He's arrogant," Calder said, his voice low. The safe, it was a child's toy. He's so used to buying the law, he forgot to worry about the locks. They ducked into the empty livery, the air hot and thick with the smell of hay and ammonia. Lark kept watch at the door while Calder laid the book on a workbench in the dim light. The spine was embossed in gold-leaf transcontinental rail. Operations, CW Spring, CW Spring, Copper Willow Spring. Calder opened it. The pages were filled with neat, arrogant script. It wasn't just a list of expenses. It was a plan. "Lark," he said, his voice grim. She came to his side. He pointed a finger at a page, half-filled. The header read, "Spring Project Expenses." "Look at the payees." Her eyes scanned the list. B. Kelleher, $20. Public Safety Stipend. B. Kelleher, $30. Travel expenses, red notch. G. Sutter, $100. Consultation. G. Sutter, $200. Security management. And then, the line that made her blood run cold. GS-17, $50. Stock management, problem clearing. GS-17. She breathed. Peter's note, the payment for the hooked shoes. He paid them $50 for murder. It gets worse. Calder said. He turned the page. It was a schedule. Projected timeline, CW Spring Boiler Station. Day 1, secure water rights 5. Pike. Day 7. Clear existing claimants G. Sutter. Day 10. Begin groundbreaking. They were on day 6. He never meant to buy it, Lark said, the rage making her shake. He was always going to take it. He wasn't just going to take it from you. Lark, look at this. Tucked inside the back cover of the ledger was a folded map. Calder spread it open. It was a geological survey of the entire last light basin. The blue line of Copper Willow Spring was the artery, but from it, a dozen smaller blue lines branched out, tracing the underground aquifer. That's, Lark traced a line with her finger. That's Miller's Creek, and that's the shallow well for the Hobbs place, and the south pasture they all feed from your spring. Calder finished for her. If Pike dams Copper Willow to feed his boiler station, he doesn't just cut you off, he dries up the entire lower basin. Every small ranch the Hobbs family, the Millers, they'd be bankrupt from drought inside 6 months. He's not just grabbing your water, Lark, he's grabbing the whole basin in one move. It was a quiet, legal massacre, the economic motive, laid bare in ink. Lark felt sick. She leaned against the workbench, her hand landing on the back cover of the open ledger. She felt something, a bump, something taped inside the back cover. Calder, there's something else. He turned the heavy book over. Taped to the inside of the thick leather backing was a square of cardstock. It was a gelatin silver photograph. Lark took it, her hands trembling, her breath caught in her throat. It was Peter. He was alive. He was standing at the edge of the red notch, the landscape unmistakable. And he was arguing. He was angry, his arms crossed, his chin jutting forward in the stubborn way she knew so well. Facing him, His back half turned to the camera, was Vaughn Pike. Pike's hand was raised, his finger jabbing at Peter's chest. It was a picture of the exact moment she had guessed. The moment Peter told him the deal was off. "The night before," she whispered, a tear blurring the image. This is the proof. This is the last time he was seen alive. Someone took this." "Sutter," Calder said, his voice hard as iron. "He was documenting, proving to Pike that Peter was a problem. This is the motive, the argument, the place. It's everything." "Let's go," Lark said. Her voice transformed. The grief was gone, replaced by cold, pure steel. "We have it all." "Not quite." Calder said, "We have the book. We have the map. But we need to use them." They slipped the map and the photograph inside the ledger. Calder tucked the heavy book under his arm. They stepped out of the livery, back into the alleyway, and stopped. He was standing 20 yards away, blocking the exit to the street. Gideon Sutter. He was leaning against the brick wall, casually, as if he'd been waiting for a train. He was smoking a thin, dark cigar, and he smiled when he saw them. It was a polite, terrible smile. "A fascinating collection of office supplies, Mrs. Ellison," Sutter said, his smooth voice echoing slightly in the narrow space. "Mr. Pike is so very careless with his paperwork." Calder stepped slightly in front of Lark. His hand did not go to his gun. He just stood. "Move aside, Sutter." "Oh, I'm not here to stop you," Sutter said with a soft laugh. He took a puff of his cigar. "I'm here to negotiate. You see, you have a problem. You have a book. But the only judge in this town is on Mr. Pike's payroll. That book, it will vanish from evidence. Sheriff Kelleher will declare it a forgery. You will be charged with theft." He gestured with his cigar. "But I appreciate your initiative. It's bracing. So, I'm empowered to make an offer. Mr. Pike is, at his core, a businessman. He understands that inconvenience has a price. Name yours." "What?" Lark said, stepping out from behind Calder. "Your price," Sutter said, his eyes locking on hers. "For the book, and for your silence. Leave Juniper Hollow. Leave the basin. Start over. Somewhere green, somewhere wet. $5,000 10. Enough to make this all just a bad memory." Lark stared at him. The heat, the smell of cigar smoke, the sheer, cold-blooded business of it all. He was offering to buy her husband's life for $10,000. She did not scream. She did not cry. She walked forward, her boots silent on the dust, until she was standing directly in front of him. He smiled, thinking he had won. "Wise choice, Mrs. Ellison. Now, if you'll just execute." Lark gives him a clean slap. The sound was not a slap. It was a crack, sharp, clean, and brutal, echoing off the brick walls like a gunshot. It was not a hysterical gesture. It was a clear, concise, and definitive answer. Gideon Sutter's head snapped to the side. His thin cigar fell from his open mouth onto the dust. The smile was gone. A bright red handprint began to bloom on his pale cheek. He stood there for a full 5 seconds. Then, very slowly, he turned his head back. His eyes, no longer polite, were the color of dead ice. He raised one finger and gently, almost curiously, touched his cheek. "I see," he whispered. "A pity. You would have been very wealthy." He straightened his suit jacket and bent to retrieve his cigar. He looked at it, then dropped it, grinding it into the dirt with his polished boot heel. "Very well," he said, his voice now stripped of all its silk, flat and cold as a blade. "We'll speak in court." He turned and walked away, disappearing onto the busy street. "We have to ride. Now," Calder said. "Not to the ranch." He wasn't bluffing about Kelleher. "We can't use the law here." "Then where?" "Copper Vale," Calder said, already moving toward the horses. "It's 30 miles, but the circuit judge, Elias Thorne, is there. He's a federal appointee. He doesn't answer to Pike. He doesn't answer to anyone but the law." They rode. They didn't spare the horses. They pushed north, out of Gray Butte, bypassing Juniper Hollow, taking the high ridge, the ledger safe in Calder's saddlebag, the photograph tucked inside Lark's blouse, against her heart. They stopped only once, at Ora Finch's wagon, which they intercepted on the main road. She was already on her way to Copper Vale. "Zeke's already there," Ora said, her face grim. "He's terrified, but he's ready. I've written my own testimony." She handed Lark a sealed envelope. "The time of death, the cut reins, the mud on Bram's boot. It's all there. You go, child. You bring the thunder. We'll be the lightning." They reached Copper Vale by dusk. Judge Thorne was a stern, white-bearded man who saw them in his cramped hotel room. They laid it all out on his table: the hooked horseshoe, the silver lighter, Zeke's invoice, Ora's affidavit, the CW spring ledger, the basin map, and last, Lark placed the photograph of Peter on top of the pile. The judge was silent for a long time, looking at the evidence, his face unreadable. He looked from the photograph to Lark's face. "This is the most damnable conspiracy I have seen since the war. Mrs. Ellison," he said finally, his voice quiet, "I will sign a federal warrant for the arrest of Vaughn Pike, Gideon Sutter, and Sheriff Bram Kelleher. They will be brought here to my court to answer for this." Relief, pure and total, washed over Lark. She nearly collapsed. The ride back to Juniper Hollow was slow. They were exhausted, but for the first time, they were not running. They were victorious. They reached the edge of Gray Butte as the sun set and found the road blocked. Sheriff Bram Kelleher was there, sitting on his horse, but he wasn't alone. He had 2 men with him, rough-looking men wearing new deputy badges, men Lark recognized from the railroad crew. Well, Bram sneered, his face red and sweating. He looked terrified, and that made him dangerous. "Look who's back, Mrs. Lark Ellison." He unrolled a piece of paper. "By the authority of Last Light County, I have a warrant for your arrest." "What?" Lark stared. "You're the one who's finished. Bram, Judge Thorne has a warrant for you." Judge Thorne ain't in this county," Bram spat. "But I am, and you, ma'am, are under arrest." "On what charge?" Calder demanded, his hand moving to rest on his thigh, near his holster. Bram smiled, a horrible, triumphant leer. "Destruction of private property, breaking and entering the Transcontinental Railroad office, and theft of one company ledger." Word had traveled faster than their horses. Sutter had used the telegraph. He had filed the charge first. People were stopping. They were coming out of the general store, the saloon. A crowd was gathering, a ring of silent, watching faces. They had all heard about the barn. They had all heard about the saloon. And now they were watching the sheriff arrest the widow. "He's arresting her?" a woman whispered, loud enough to be heard. "After they burned her barn," a man added. "That's not justice," another voice called out. The crowd was shifting. The air was electric. Half of them were afraid, their eyes on Bram's new deputies. But the other half were angry. The scales, as Sutter had called them, were finally beginning to tip. The warrant was a death sentence, and the crowd was a jury of ghosts. Bram Kelleher, his face a mottled purple of rage and fear, held the paper high. "Lark Ellison, I am taking you in, now. You can come easy. She's not going anywhere with you, Bram," Calder said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the murmuring crowd. He was not looking at the sheriff. He was looking at the 2 new deputies, his eyes flat and cold. "Those badges are fresh. The ink's barely dry." "That's enough," Bram roared, his hand grabbing his pistol. "You're under arrest, to aid in a fugitive." It was the opening Calder needed. He wasn't going to draw on a lawman, not in front of 20 witnesses. He was going to move. "Lark, ride, now!" He didn't wait for her. He grabbed her arm, almost pulling her from her saddle, and kicked his own bay. The horse, trained for close work, slammed its shoulder into Bram's horse. The sheriff cried out, his horse rearing, as Calder's bay created a wall of flesh. "They're running!" one of the deputies yelled. Chaos erupted. The crowd, which had been a tight ring, dissolved. People screamed and dove for cover. It was all the cover they needed. "North!" Calder yelled. "To the high pass!" They galloped, leaning low over their horses' necks, tearing through the main street of Grey Butte. The sound of shouts and 2 wild, inaccurate gunshots followed them. They didn't look back. Bram and his men were right behind them. They were railroad men, not ranchers, but they had fresh horses and a straight road. Lark and Calder had exhausted mounts and a desperate plan. "He'll try to cut us off at the fork," Lark yelled over the thunder of hooves. "We're not going to the fork." Calder veered, pulling his horse hard to the right, leaving the main road entirely. He plunged into a dry riverbed, the loose rock shifting and sliding. "Where are we going?" "Windcut Pass," he yelled. "They won't follow us there, not if they value their necks." Windcut Pass was a lie. It wasn't a pass. It was a scar, a high, narrow fissure in the granite spine of the mountain. It was a place where the wind was born, and it was barely wide enough for a single pack mule. They rode for an hour, the pursuit falling back, then closing in again. Bram was pushing his men hard. He knew, just as they did, that this was not about an arrest. This was about silencing a witness. The sky, which had been a clear, unforgiving blue, began to change. The air grew heavy. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes. "Calder," Lark said, looking up. A dark, bruised purple cloud was boiling over the peak, rolling down the mountain toward them. "The first rain," he said, his voice grim. "It's early." The first drops were huge, cold, and splattered against the dry rock like coins. Then, as if a barrel had been upended, the sky opened. It was not a gentle rain. It was a cold, high-country deluge, a sheet of icy water that turned the world gray. The dry granite became a sheet of black, slick ice. They reached the entrance to the pass. It was worse than Lark remembered. A narrow shelf, slick with water, a sheer drop on one side. "We have to go on foot," she yelled. "No time," Calder pointed behind them. Bram and his men were at the mouth of the canyon, dismounting, moving to take aim. A bullet pinged off the rock above Lark's head, showering her with granite chips. "Go trust your horse." Calder slapped the rump of her mare. Juniper. The mare plunged forward. Onto the ledge, Lark held her breath. Her knees clamped tight. The horse's iron shoes skidded, finding no purchase. It happened in a heartbeat. Juniper's back legs went out. The horse screamed, a high, terrifying sound, and scrambled, its front hooves digging for purchase on the slick rock. The mare's weight shifted, tipping her and Lark toward the open air. Lark was thrown free of the saddle. She didn't fall. She slid. She hit the edge of the cliff, her fingers clawing at the wet stone, finding nothing. She was gone. "Lark!" His voice was a raw tear in the fabric of the storm. She didn't fall far. Her foot caught, just for a second, on a root, but she was dangling, her hand sliding on the muddy rock. A 20-foot drop to the jagged boulders below. She saw a boot slam down next to her face. Calder. He was off his horse, flat on his belly on the ledge, his face inches from hers. He wasn't reaching. He was lunging, his hand clamped around her wrist. It wasn't the gentle, healing touch from the spring. It was a vice, a trap. I'm slipping," she cried, her bandaged arm useless. "I have you," he roared against the wind. "Pull!" He heaved. His arm, the one holding her entire weight, was rigid. She could see the muscles in his forearm, stark and white, but she also saw it shaking. It was shaking from the cold, from the sudden strain, from the sheer, desperate effort. He was strong, but he was human. She kicked, finding a toehold, and he pulled again, grunting, dragging her up over the lip of the rock. They collapsed onto the ledge, a tangle of wet limbs. They were both gasping, soaked to the skin, their breath pluming in the icy air. Juniper, her horse, had recovered her footing and stood trembling, her head low. Below them, they could hear Bram yelling, but the rain was too loud, the wind too fierce. They were hidden, for now. Lark was on her hands and knees, her hair plastered to her face, shaking so hard she couldn't breathe. The adrenaline was a sick, hot wave. She had almost died. Again. "Lark, Lark, are you hurt?" Calder knelt in front of her, his hands hovering, afraid to touch her. She looked up. Her face was streaked with rain and mud. She was breathing in short, desperate gasps. And then a sound bubbled up in her chest. It was wild, watery, and completely mad. She laughed. She laughed. A ragged, breathless sound that was half a sob. "Lark!" He looked terrified. He thought she'd broken. She shook her head, pushing her wet hair back. Her eyes, bright and clear, locked on his. The fear was gone, replaced by a raw, startling honesty. "I'm trembling," she panted, the rain dripping from her chin. It's not because I was scared. I mean, I was, but that's not why I'm shaking now." He was just staring at her, his gray eyes wide, trying to understand. "It's because you're looking at me," she whispered. That was all it took. The space between them, which had been filled with rain and wind and fear, was suddenly electric. This was not the gentle comfort of the spring. This was the jagged, desperate edge of the cliff. This was life, raw and immediate. He moved. He didn't ask. He didn't hesitate. He surged forward, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs wiping the rain from her cheeks. And he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a crash. It was all the fear, all the tension, all the desperation of the last week. It was the crack of the shovel on bone, the roar of the fire, the ping of the bullet. It was the certainty of the fall and the solid, shaking strength of the rescue. His lips were cold from the rain but burning with life. His hand slid from her face to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her wet hair, holding her fast, anchoring her. She didn't just receive it. She answered. Her hands came up, gripping the front of his soaked coat, then sliding up, her fingers digging into his shoulders, holding on, pulling him closer. It was a kiss that said, "I am alive and you are the reason." The world dissolved. There was no chase. There was no warrant. There was only the roar of the rain, the cold sting of the wind, and the solid, undeniable, living warmth of him. He pulled back, just enough to breathe, his forehead resting against hers. They were both shaking. "We have to move," he murmured, his voice thick. "Where?" "The juniper cave. I know it. It's close. It's dry." He pulled her to her feet, his hand locked in hers. They grabbed the reins of the horses and plunged back into the storm, climbing, disappearing into the mist and the rock. The juniper cave was barely a cave at all. It was a deep, wind-hollowed cleft in the rock, protected by a curtain of ancient, gnarled juniper trees. But it was dry, and out of the wind. They stumbled inside, their horses huddled just outside, their backs to the storm. Calder set to work immediately. He pulled dry shavings from the heart of a dead juniper branch, struck a flint against his steel, and in moments, a small, precious flame flickered to life. He fed it, nurtured it, until a small, crackling fire pushed back the oppressive, wet cold. Lark stood shivering, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. The adrenaline was gone, leaving a bone-deep chill. Her burned arm was a dull, throbbing pain under its soaking bandage. Calder turned to her. He took off his heavy duster. The canvas shell soaked, but the wool lining still held patches of dry warmth. "Here," he said. He draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy, and it smelled of him of leather, and smoke, and the clean scent of the high country rain. He did not crowd her. He gave her the fire. He moved to the mouth of the cave, his rifle in hand, and stood watch, a silent, solid silhouette against the gray, weeping sky. He was giving her space, respect. Lark sat by the fire, wringing the water from her hair. She was wrapped in his coat, his warmth, but he was 6 feet away, a respectful, agonizing distance. The silence stretched, filled only by the hiss and crackle of the fire and the drumming of the rain. She looked at him. His back was to her. a solid wall against the storm. He was protecting her, yes, but he was also separate. He was honoring the line, and she realized she didn't want him to. Calder. Her voice was quiet, just barely carrying over the storm. He turned. His face was shadowed, unreadable. She didn't say anything else. She just looked at him. And then she put her hand on his coat that she was wearing. She clutched the lapel, and then, her eyes never leaving his, she gave the smallest, almost imperceptible tug. Execute pulls him half a step closer. It was not a command. It was an invitation. His gaze held hers. He saw the question. He saw the clear, unambiguous consent. He crossed the small space in 2 steps and sat on the stone floor beside her. Not touching, just near. The firelight played on his face. He was waiting. Lark let out a breath she'd been holding since the pass. She leaned, slowly, her shoulder touching his. He didn't flinch. He was as solid as the mountain around them. She leaned more, resting her head on his shoulder. His arm came around her. Execute. They hugged tightly. He pulled her in, tucking her against his side, sharing the duster, sharing his own body heat. His arm was strong, secure. She was no longer shivering from the cold. She was just trembling. They sat like that for a long time. The fire crackled. The storm raged outside their small sanctuary. She felt the steady, slow rise and fall of his chest. It was the sound of safety. She had fallen, and he had caught her. "Cauldron," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I'm here." She tilted her head back, just enough to look at his jawline in the firelight. The question that had been buried under all her rage and grief. The question she had asked at the spring. Returned. But it meant more now. It was no longer a hypothetical. She had just fallen. "Execute. If I really fall apart, will you still hold me?" He tightened his grip. His other hand came up, his fingers brushing the wet hair from her temple. He didn't make a grand, impossible promise. He gave her the truth. "Execute until you stop trembling." It was enough. Execute intimacy stops at the long embrace. They did not kiss again. They did not need to. The long, shared embrace was more intimate than any kiss. It was 2 hearts, battered and exhausted, finally setting down their burdens. Execute shared breath, looking to tomorrow. She closed her eyes, her breath synchronizing with his, and for the first time since Peter's death, Lark Ellison felt safe. They slept, huddled together against the rock. 2 survivors warmed by 1 small fire. The morning broke cold and brilliantly clear. The storm had passed, washing the air clean. The basin below was a sea of white mist. Lark woke first, her body stiff but warm. She was still wrapped in his arms, in his coat. "They're still down there," she said quietly. "I know." He answered. He was awake, too. "They think we're trapped, or dead." "Let them," he said. He gently untangled himself. Standing to stretch his stiff limbs, he went to the mouth of the cave and looked down. "But we need to get to Judge Thorne," Lark said, standing and shaking out the heavy duster. We need help. Bram's men are watching the pass, but he's not the only one who can read this mountain." Calder said. He picked up a branch. "Bram is looking for a fight, but the rest of them, the people in the crowd, the Hobbses, the Millers, Aura, Zeke, they're just waiting for a sign." He began to rebuild the fire, but this time, he didn't use the dry wood. He began breaking off heavy, green branches from the juniper tree. "What are you doing?" "Bram's signal is a gunshot." Calder said, "A rancher's signal is smoke." He laid the green branches on the hot coals. A thick, white, aromatic plume of smoke began to rise, not in a panic-driven wisp, but in a steady, solid column. It pushed up, past the cliff edge, and into the clear morning sky. A beacon that could be seen for 20 miles. Execute smoke signal. "It's not an SOS, Lark said, understanding. A slow smile spread across her face. "It's a call. They'll know the trail," Calder said, adding another branch. They'll know this cave. They'll know it's not the sheriff. They'll know it's us. We're not just hiding. Lark, we're gathering. We're pulling the truth and the jury to our side." The smoke signal was an arrow of white, clean juniper smoke against a clear blue sky. It was a rancher's signal, a call, not an SOS. By noon, they were not alone. First came the Hobbs family, a man and his 2 grown sons, all carrying rifles. Then the Millers, who had lost their well. They didn't come asking questions. They came with grim faces and full cartridge belts. They had seen the smoke. They had heard the rumors from Gray Butte, and they had made a choice. When Ora Finch and Zeke Hart arrived in their buckboard, they were at the head of a small, grim delegation of a dozen ranchers. They did not ride to Gray Butte. They bypassed the railroad town entirely. They rode, a small, dusty army of the dispossessed, straight to Coppervale. They found Judge Elias Thorne on the steps of the hotel, a federal marshal at his side. He had seen them coming. "It seems, Mrs. Ellison," the judge said, his white beard bristling in the breeze, "you have brought the jury with you." Vaughn Pike, alerted by telegraph, was already there. He was not a fool. He had brought his tailcoat lawyer, a man named Mr. Pettigrew, from Sacramento. Pettigrew was a thin, pale man who looked perpetually annoyed by the dust and the sunlight. Sheriff Bram Kelleher stood behind them, his face the color of old dough. He was sweating through his wool vest, his badge pinned so crooked it was nearly falling off. Gideon Sutter was nowhere to be seen. "Your Honor," Pettigrew began, his voice high and reedy, "this is a procedural outrage. We are here to answer a warrant for theft, filed by my client against this woman. This gathering, it is not a court. It is a mob." Judge Thorne looked at the 50 or 60 armed, silent ranchers who had formed a dense, quiet circle in the wide warehouse yard. "This is not a mob, Mr. Pettigrew," the judge said, his voice a low boom. "This is the public, and in my territory, the public is welcome in a court of law." He pointed to a heavy loading dock. "That will be my bench. We will have this hearing here, in the light." For the next hour, a field court was assembled. A simple pine table was set for the judge. Another was set in the center. "Mr. Pettigrew," the judge said, "your client, Mr. Pike, and Sheriff Kelleher stand accused by federal warrant of conspiracy to extort, conspiracy to defraud, obstruction of justice, and as an accessory to the murder of Peter Ellison, Mrs. Ellison. Present your evidence." Lark stepped forward. Calder stood just behind her, his hands clasped, his face impassive. He was not a witness. He was a guardian. Lark carried her mother's iron chest. She placed it on the table and unlatched it. She was calm. The shaking was gone. The cold, clear anger had returned. But it was no longer hot. It was heavy, and it was sharp. "Your Honor, 4 days ago, my husband was murdered at the Red Notch. The town was told it was an accident. It was a lie." She began to build her case, piece by damning piece. Exhibit A. She reached into the chest and pulled out the heavy, burlap-wrapped object. She placed it on the table with a solid thud. It was the hooked horseshoe. "This is a custom-forged horseshoe, made by Zeke Hart. It was not made for ranching. It was made to tear up the ground and drive a herd. This is the mark that was left at the Red Notch." Pettigrew scoffed. "A shoe? You accuse a man of murder with a shoe." Lark ignored him. Exhibit B. She held up the silver lighter. V.P. glittering in the sun. "This was dropped by the man Vaughn Pike sent to burn my barn to the ground 2 nights ago. An attempt to destroy me, and any evidence I might have." Pike whispered furiously to his lawyer. Exhibit C. She placed the heavy CW spring ledger on the table. Mr. Pike's own book. In it, he details payments to Sheriff Bram Kelleher for public safety stipends and travel expenses to the Red Notch. It also details payments to Gideon Sutter for security management and problem clearing. "Stolen," Pettigrew shrieked. "That book was stolen. It is inadmissible. It is evidence of a crime, sir." The judge snapped. It is highly admissible. Continue. Mrs. Ellison. Exhibit D. Lark held up Zeke's invoice. A payment receipt from Mr. Hart's Forge. It matches the ledger. Code GS17. $50 for 12 hooked horseshoes. The payment Von Pike made for the tools to murder my husband. A low, animal sound came from the crowd. Bram Kelleher looked like he was going to be sick. Exhibit E. She pointed to her own feet. The boots I stand in. They are covered in the alkali dust of this basin. But, she pulled Peter's mud-caked trousers from the chest. This is the red clay of the Red Notch, the ground where Peter died. It is the same red mud, Your Honor, that I saw caked on Sheriff Kelleher's boot when he came to my home to tell me it was a tragic accident. He was there. He lied. He covered the tracks. The crowd was a solid, low roar. And finally, Lark said, her voice dropping, Exhibit F. She laid the small, square photograph on the table. The last picture ever taken of my husband, alive, arguing with Von Pike at the Red Notch the night before he was killed. This is the motive, the argument that cost him his life. She stepped back. The silence in the yard was absolute. I call my first witness. Lark said, Ora Finch. Ora stepped forward, her face calm and certain. I am the midwife and healer for this basin, she said, her voice clear. I examined Peter Ellison's body before he was buried. Mr. Pettigrew may claim he fell, but a fall does not slice a leather rein clean through. It was cut. I am also prepared to swear that, based on the state of the body, the time of death was approximately 10 o'clock in the morning. Sheriff Kelleher claims he arrived at noon, yet his boots were covered in the same mud as the victim. I call Zeke Hart, Lark said. Zeke stumbled forward, his hands twisting his hat. I'm Zeke Hart. I'm the smith. It's true. I made the shoes. He Von Pike, he ordered them. He pointed a shaking finger at Pike. He paid with that voucher, GS17. He said they were for stock management. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know. Mr. Pettigrew was on his feet, his face pale. He looked desperate. He looked out into the crowd and seemed to find what he was looking for. This is a circus, a blacksmith, a herb woman. This is not evidence. It is hearsay and speculation. The defense, Your Honor, calls a real witness, Dr. Silas Croft. A small, greasy man in a stained suit pushed his way through the crowd. He smelled of cheap tonic. Dr. Croft, Pettigrew said, his confidence returning. Did you see Mr. Peter Ellison on the night before his tragic accident? That I did, sir, Croft said, his voice oily. He licked his lips. I saw him at the Dusty Laurel Saloon, in Grey Butte. And what was his condition? Doctor, he was in his cups, sir, deeply, stumbling drunk. Croft sighed. A performance of pity. He was complaining about his wife, his debts. He was a mess, a tragedy waiting to happen. It's my professional opinion he was drunk when he got on that horse. He spooked his own herd, a terrible, tragic accident. The air went out of the crowd. This changed things. A drunk man on a cliff. It was plausible. It was simple. Von Pike's smile returned. Bram Kelleher let out a shaky breath. Gideon Sutter, who Lark now spotted at the very back of the crowd, leaning against a wall, nodded once, as if to say, checkmate. Lark did not look at the judge. She did not look at Dr. Croft. She looked at Ora Finch. Ora met her gaze and gave a small, firm nod. Dr. Croft, Lark said, her voice dangerously quiet. You are swearing, under oath, that you saw my husband drinking whiskey at the saloon. As a fish, ma'am, Croft said, trying a smile. That's a lie. Lark's voice snapped like a whip. A complete, bald-faced lie. Objection, Pettigrew shouted. The widow is distraught. She is slandering a medical professional. Is she? Judge Thorne said, his eyes on Lark. Prove it, Mrs. Ellison. Peter Ellison, Lark said, her voice ringing out, silencing the crowd. Had not touched a drop of strong liquor in 6 months. She turned to Aura. Aura, the receipt. Aura Finch stepped forward, holding 2 items, a small brown bottle and a piece of paper. As I said, Aura announced, I am a healer. Peter Ellison came to me 2 months ago. Worried about the drought? Yes, but he was not drinking. In fact, he was doing everything in his power not to. I sold him this. She held up the bottle. A tonic of milk thistle and dandelion, for sobriety, to keep his mind clear. She then held up the paper. And this is his receipt, for that tonic, paid in full, 3 days before he died. Peter was not a drunk. Your Honor, he was a good man, trying to stay strong. This doctor is a fraud. He's a liar, paid by the railroad. The crowd erupted. The drunk story, the one pillar the defense had, shattered into 1,000 pieces. He's a liar, a man yelled. I'm Pike's man. Before the judge could call for order, another man stepped out of the crowd. It was Mr. Hobbs. From the low basin. She's telling the truth. Judge about the lies, he yelled, his face red. Vaughn Pike, he came to me last month. He offered me $200 for my water rights. Told me if I didn't sell, he'd dry me out. Me too, another man shouted, stepping forward. It was Miller. He said my deed was worthless and that the railroad was coming. One way or another, he was trying to steal the whole basin. The tide had not just turned. It had become a flood. The crowd was a wall of accusation. Vaughn Pike was white as a sheet. His lawyer, Pettigrew, was frantically stuffing papers into his briefcase. Your Honor, Lark called out, her voice cutting through the noise. She stepped back to the table, to the iron chest. The ranchers are right. It wasn't just my husband. It was never just about my water. It was about all of us. She pulled out the last 2 pieces of paper. This, she said, holding up a faded, stamped document, is my territorial deed, the legal, binding water right for Copper Willow Spring. She then unrolled the large survey map from Pike's ledger. And this is Vaughn Pike's plan, his map for the new boiler station, taken from his own safe. She didn't just lay them on the table. She held them up, side by side, for the entire crowd to see. Look, she cried, her voice breaking with the sheer, terrible clarity of it. Look where his station is, not near the spring. It is on top of the spring. She then overlaid the map on her deed, a perfect, damning match. And look at these lines. She traced the blue aquifer lines on the survey map. His dam doesn't just stop my water. That line, that's the Miller Creek. That one, that's the Hobbs family. Well, that one is the South Pasture. He wasn't just murdering my husband for one spring. He was murdering this entire basin. He was going to turn us all to dust. This was the moment. The Mu Dolo sang. The plot, in all its greedy, murderous scope, was exposed. The ranchers and farmers stared at the map, seeing their own ruin, their own futures, drawn in Pike's arrogant ink. Judge Elias Thorne stood up. His face was thunder. He didn't speak for a full 10 seconds. He let the roar of the crowd build. Enough, he bellowed. The yard fell silent. He held up the federal warrants he had signed the night before. I came here to investigate a theft. I have found a kingdom of corruption. He looked at the 2 terrified, new deputies who had come with Bram. You 2, take off those badges. Leave. They ripped them from their chests, dropped them in the dust, and scrambled into the crowd. Vaughn Pike, Bram Kelleher. The judge's voice was a flat, hard blade. By the authority of the United States Territorial Court, I find overwhelming probable cause. You are hereby arrested on charges of criminal conspiracy, deprivation of rights, extortion, and obstruction of a federal investigation. You will be held without bail to stand trial for the murder of Peter Ellison. It was over. 2 U.S. Marshals, who had been waiting in the warehouse, stepped out. They moved through the crowd, which parted like the sea. Pike stood, stunned. As the irons were snapped on his wrists, Bram Kelleher simply collapsed, sobbing, into the dust. Lark stood, her hand on the iron chest. She watched them. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel joy. She just felt the heavy, final thud of the truth landing. She felt done. Calder's hand found her arm, steadying her. She leaned into him, just for a second. Across the yard, Calder was scanning. He was looking for the one man who was not in chains. He saw him, Gideon Sutter. He was at the far end of the alley, 100 yards away, already moving. He was not running. He was departing. He paused, as if feeling Calder's gaze, and turned. He looked at Calder. He looked at Lark. His face was not angry or defeated. It was a mask of cold, reptilian calm. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He said something. The words were too far to hear, but his lips were clear. "It's not over. I'll be back, like a shadow." Lark, seeing it too, shivered. Calder put his arm around her, pulling her close. He looked back at the disappearing figure of Gideon Sutter, and he spoke, his voice low. "For her, and her alone. Shadows need light to exist," he said, "and we finally have the light." The trial was over, but the work of justice had just begun. The crowd in the warehouse yard did not cheer, as the U.S. Marshals led Vaughn Pike and a sobbing, hollowed-out Bram Kelleher away in irons. A strange, profound silence fell. It was not the silence of fear that had choked the basin for months. It was the sound of a heavy weight being lifted. It was the collective, shuddering sigh of 50 families breathing free for the first time. Justice, Lark realized, didn't always arrive with a thunderclap. Sometimes it came with the quiet finality of a lock clicking shut. Judge Thorne was not a man to let grass grow. He was a creature of law, and the law, he believed, must be swift and solid. He spent the next 2 days in Copper Vale, issuing judgments that unraveled Vaughn Pike's web, one thread at a time. Vaughn Pike's assets, held by the Transcontinental Rail, are hereby frozen, he declared from his makeshift bench, his voice echoing in the now crowded warehouse. All scrip and vouchers issued by his office are declared null and void. He looked at the anxious faces of the ranchers, the Millers and the Hobbses, who had been pushed to the brink. But the man's greed, the judge continued, has left behind a trail of ill-gotten gains. The court has seized a sum of just over $8,000 in cash from his safe. This security fund, which he used to pay for problem clearing, will be seized. A murmur went through the crowd. That was a fortune. This court, Judge Thorne said, his gaze landing on Lark, believes that money, stained as it is, should be used to heal the wound it was meant to create. I am placing these funds into a new, court-administered account. We will call it the Last Light Basin Water Trust. It will be used to fund the digging of new wells, the repair of old ones, and to ensure fair access to water for every smallholder in this valley. He held up Lark's original deed. Which brings us to this. The deed for Copper Willow Spring is, and always has been, the legal and moral property of Lark Ellison. The railroad's claim is summarily and permanently rejected. He handed the paper back to her. Lark's hand shook as she took it. It was just a piece of paper, but it was everything. It was her land, her future, and Peter's legacy. She looked at the deed, then at the faces of the Hobbs family, at Mr. Miller, at the other small ranchers who had stood with her. They were watching her, their expressions a mix of hope and fear. She now held the one thing they all needed. She held the power. Lark took a deep breath. She saw, in that moment, two futures. One where she became what Pike had been, a landowner, rich with water, holding the basin hostage. And another, she walked to the judge's table. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear. May I borrow your pen?" Judge Thorne raised a white eyebrow, but handed her his ink pen. Lark laid the deed on the table. She looked at the line, owner Lark Ellison, Juniper Hollow. She dipped the pen, and then, in her clear, strong hand, she wrote new words underneath her name. The ink was a dark, definitive black. She held it up for the crowd to see. Owner, the Juniper Hollow Trust. This spring, this water, it was a gift, she said, her voice shaking just a little. It was never just mine. It was never just Peter's. It is the life of the basin. The Juniper Hollow Trust will guarantee, by law, that water is sold to every ranch in this valley, not for charity, but at a fair price, a price we all agree on, a price for neighbors, so no one ever has to face what we faced. Never again. For a moment, there was stunned silence. Then, old Mr. Hobbs took off his hat. Then Miller, one by one. Every man in the yard uncovered his head. It was a gesture of profound respect, deeper than any applause. Calder stood at the back, his arms crossed. He watched her, and the small, almost imperceptible quirk at the corner of his mouth was the proudest expression Lark had ever seen. The next week was a new beginning. The basin, which had been paralyzed by fear, exploded with activity. The energy of Pike's greed was transformed into the energy of community. The first order of business was the water. If we're going to share it, we have to protect it, Zeke Hart said. He was a new man. With Pike gone, the shame had lifted, leaving the strong, capable ironworker he'd always been. The spring runs strong, but that summer drought had nearly killed us. We need to build a small dam, a check dam. Nothing big, just enough to hold a reserve, to regulate the flow for the dry season. I can survey, Calder said quietly. The ranchers looked at him, this quiet stranger who had appeared from the dust. He's a former scout for the Union, Lark said, her voice full of pride. He knows how to read the land. He knows where the levels are. So, a team was formed. Zeke, with his knowledge of stone and iron, led the construction. The Hobbs boys brought their wagons, hauling granite from the quarry. And Calder, with his surveyor's tools and his quiet, precise eye, moved along the ravine below the spring, driving stakes, marking the water levels, ensuring the dam would be strong enough to hold, but not so large it would damage the aquifer. Lark worked alongside them. She brought coffee, she drove a wagon, she hauled stone. Her burned arm, now healing into a faint, pink scar, was a reminder of what the fire had cost. Her work now was a reminder of what it had saved. While the men worked on the dam, Ora Finch was busy with her own project, the small, abandoned homesteader's cabin near the spring, the one with the good roof, was being transformed. A clinic, she told Lark, as they whitewashed the inside walls. For 30 years, I've been bringing babies into this world on kitchen tables and mending fences with whatever rags I could find. No more. The Water Trust has money. The judge gave me $50 of it. We're going to have a proper infirmary, a place of healing, right here by the water. The women of the basin came, bringing blankets, spare cots, and jars of herbs. They built a clean, safe place. One afternoon, as Lark was helping Ora move a small iron stove, she looked out the new, clean window. The grass by the spring, fed by the constant water, was green and soft. A group of children, the Hobbs and Miller children, were there. They weren't working. They were playing. A little girl, no older than 5, with bright red hair, was chasing a puppy, her laughter a high, clear sound, like a bell. A group of boys were skipping stones in the new reservoir pool. There was no fear, no shadows, just sunlight and green grass, and the sound of children laughing. Lark stopped, her hand on the stove, and just listened. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard, a sound that had been absent from the basin for too long, a sound that proved they had truly won. That evening, as the sun was setting, Lark knew there was one last thing she had to do. She walked alone, up the small rise to Peter's grave. The raw earth had settled, and the wild grasses were already beginning to reclaim the mound. She was not wearing black. She was wearing a simple blue cotton dress, and the apricot-colored shawl was draped over her shoulders. In her hand, she held the small, tin music box. She had found a traveling tinker in Copper Vale. She'd given him $2 to fix the latch and, more importantly, to clean and oil the mechanism. She sat on the ground, the cool earth pressing through her dress. The basin was spread out before her, the new dam a solid, dark line in the dusk. The lights from the ranches beginning to twinkle, no longer hiding, but shining. "Hello, Peter," she whispered. It's done." It's really done?" She ran her thumb over the faded roses on the tin box. "I was so angry, for so long. Angry at you for signing that paper. For being tired, for leaving me. But I'm not angry anymore." She looked at the small grave, at the simple wooden cross Calder had built to replace the shovel. "You were a good man. You were a good man who made a mistake, and you were trying to fix it. You were trying to protect me. You hid that clue. GS-17, you knew I'd find it. You knew I'd figure it out. You trusted me. You're the reason we won." She paused, a single, quiet tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "I found the truth. Peter." She carefully wound the small key on the side of the box. She opened the lid. A tiny, tinny, but beautiful melody plinked out into the quiet air. A simple, hopeful tune. It was the sound of a memory, clean and clear, no longer stained by anger. It was a farewell, a real one. She set the music box, still playing, on the grave. "Rest now," she whispered. "It's all right. I'm all right." She walked back to the ranch house as the last of the music faded into the twilight. Calder was on the porch, waiting. He had been, she knew, watching her from a distance, giving her the space she needed for her goodbye. He was sitting on the top step, his back against the post, just watching the stars come out. He didn't say, "Are you okay?" He didn't ask what she'd done. He just watched her walk up the path. Lark stopped at the bottom step. She looked at him, this quiet, solid man who had come from nowhere and had become her anchor. He had seen her break. He had held her. He had fought for her. And he had never asked for a single thing in return. She looked past him, to the porch wall. The wedding shovel was leaning there, the tool she had used to bury her husband, the weapon she had used to defend her home, the symbol of all her rage and grief. She walked onto the porch. She picked it up. The hickory handle was smooth, familiar, and heavy. Cal Winder watched her, his expression unreadable. She turned and held it out to him, not as a weapon, not as a burden. It's done," she said, her voice soft. "Its work is done." He looked at the shovel, at the carved initials, P+L. "From now on," Lark said, her voice catching, but her gaze steady and sure. "It's not for burying. It's for planting. It's for building. It's for what comes next." Calder looked at the shovel. Then he looked at her. He didn't take it. Instead, he stood up. He took her hand, the one that wasn't holding the shovel, and gently uncurled her fingers. He laced his own through them, a warm, solid grip. He stepped close. His other arm came around her waist, pulling her in. He just held her. Lark let the shovel rest on the floor, its handle leaning against her shoulder. As she put her free arm around him, her head resting on his chest, she could feel his heart, steady and strong, beneath her cheek. Execute. Their eyes speak of the future. They stood in the quiet of the porch, under a sky overflowing with stars. No words were needed. The grip of his hand, the solid strength of his embrace, the steady beat of his heart, they said everything. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The seasons turned. The raw wound of Peter's grave softened, covered by the green and gold of the basin grasses. The scar on Lark's arm faded from angry red to a pale, silvery pink. The barn was rebuilt, its new pine beams smelling of a future. Not a fire, the railroad, under the stern watch of Judge Thorne and the Utah marshals, finished its line, but it skirted the basin. It found another, more expensive and less contentious route. Vaughn Pike and Bram Kelleher were gone, sent to a federal prison in the east, their names already becoming a bitter story told by old-timers. Gideon Sutter, as he had promised, vanished like a shadow. He was a whisper, a cold draft, but he was gone. Life, stubborn and insistent, returned to Last Light Basin. The Juniper Hollow Trust was a success. The small dam held, and for the first time the ranches of the low basin survived the dry season with water to spare. The wedding was on a bright, clear afternoon in late September, a year after the fire. It was not held in a church. It was held at Copper Willow Spring, under the generous, whispering canopy of the willow trees. The only decorations were the sunlight, the green grass, and the sound of the water that had cost so much and given back more. A single long wooden table was set, covered not with white lace, but with the soft, faded apricot-colored shawl that had been Lark's mother's. The guests were few, but they were the ones who had mattered. Ora Finch, her face wreathed in a rare, soft smile. Zeke Hart, his massive hands scrubbed clean, holding his wife's hand. The Hobbs family and the Millers, their children, scrubbed and shy, holding small, hand-picked bunches of wild aster. Judge Elias Thorne himself had ridden out, not as a federal power, but as a friend, to officiate. Lark did not wear a white veil or a store-bought dress. She wore a simple, elegant dress of pale muslin, one she had sewn herself in the long, quiet evenings. It was practical, strong, and beautiful, just like the woman who wore it. She wore no shawl of mourning. The only adornment was her mother's other apricot shawl, the one Calder had used to tie back her hair at this very spring. She used it as a ribbon, her dark hair pulled back simply. She did not hide the scars on her arm or the fine network of sun and wind lines around her eyes. She stood in the light, wholly herself. Calder stood waiting for her by the water. He wore no suit. He wore a simple, clean white shirt and dark trousers. He was, as always, unadorned. But in the breast pocket of his shirt, Lark could see the small, heavy outline of his old Union Scout badge. He'd polished it. He wore it not as a decoration, but as a private promise, tucked over his heart, a reminder to always watch over what was right. There was no organ. The only music was a single banjo, played softly by one of the Hobbs boys, a gentle, rippling tune that mixed with the sound of the spring. Lark walked to him, alone, her boots silent on the grass. She stopped in front of him. Calder did not look at her as if she were a prize. He looked at her as if he were seeing, for the first time in a long time, a safe harbor. Judge Thorne cleared his throat. We are gathered here not by tradition, but by choice, not by law, but by a profound and earned justice. These two people have seen the worst of this land, and they have chosen to build the best of it. There is no book, no words that can do justice to what they have forged. So, I will ask them to use their own. He nodded to Lark. Lark looked at Calder. Her voice was not loud, but it carried, clear as the water beside them. I came to this porch, to this land, a bride. I held a shovel in my hands that was meant for planting, and then I was forced to use it for burying. My husband, my hope. She swallowed, her eyes locked on his. For a year, I thought that shovel was a weapon, a tool of anger, a tool of an ending. But you came. You stood with me. You held me when I fell apart. She reached out and took his hand. Calder Shaw, you taught me that the shovel was never an end. It was just turning the soil. What I buried was my fear. And today, her voice cracked, just once, today, standing here, I am planting my hope. With you. A tear traced its way down Ora's cheek. Calder turned his hand, lacing his fingers through hers. He had never been a man of many words, and he was not one now. He spoke simply, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. Lark, I have been a scout, a man who moves. I've been watching my own back for so long, I forgot what it felt like to stand still. I forgot what a home was. You are the strongest person I have ever known, but you've been strong for too long. He gently squeezed her hand. I won't ever ask you to be less than you are, but I will be the shoulder you lean on when the weight is too much. I will be the one who stands watch, so you can rest. I will be your home, and I will always be here to hold you. Judge Thorne's voice was thick. Well, I've heard a lot of vows, but none truer, by the power vested in me by the United States territory, and by the undeniable power of what I see before me, I pronounce you man and wife. He looked at Calder. Go on, son. Kiss your bride. Calder stepped forward. Execute firm, slow kiss. He did not grab her. He did not pull her. He moved into her space, one hand coming to rest firmly on the small of her back, a gesture of pure support. Lark raised her own hand, Execute hand on his jaw, and placed it on his jaw, her thumb brushing his cheek. It was an anchor, a claim. The kiss was firm, slow, and deep. It was not the desperate, rain-soaked kiss on the cliff. It was not the healing, gentle kiss at the spring. It was a promise. It was a seal. It was the planting of the seed. The small crowd broke into cheers. The banjo player struck up a lively, dancing tune. The celebration was simple. It was not a party. It was a supper. There was fresh-baked cornbread and wild strawberry jam Ora had put up. There was coffee and fresh, cold water from the spring. The ranchers, as their wedding gift, unveiled what they had been working on in secret for a week. Zeke Hart and Mr. Hobbs led them to the head of the spring, to the small, sturdy dam. There, they had built a simple, beautiful arched gate of carved juniper wood. Spanning the head of the ravine, it was the new entrance to the water. And carved deep into the lintel, Zeke's ironwork shining, were two names Lark Calder. "It's a water gate," Zeke said, beaming, his face red. To honor the trust, to honor you both." Lark touched the carved letters of her name, her heart so full she could barely speak. They stayed until the sun began to dip, painting the high cliffs of the basin in shades of orange and deep purple. One by one, the families bid them good night, heading back to their own ranches, their own homes, leaving the newlyweds in the quiet of the descending dusk. They rode back to the ranch house, side by side, not speaking, their horses' hooves a soft, rhythmic beat on the trail. The air was cooling, carrying the sharp, clean scent of sage. They stood on the porch, the same porch where he had first seen her, a widow in black, and where she had first asked him, "Will you believe me?" The house was quiet. The war was over. The work was done. Lark leaned her head against the porch post, looking out at the vast, darkening pasture. It was hers. It was theirs. She turned to him. He was watching her, his face soft in the twilight, his gray eyes full of a quiet, steady warmth she had come to rely on more than the sun. She whispered, her voice a small, familiar echo of a desperate night in the rain. "Execute. Will you still hold me if I—" Calder smiled. He didn't let her finish. He closed the small space between them, his arms coming around her, pulling her close, flush against his chest. He bent his head, his lips brushing her temple. "Execute always." He lifted her, as if she weighed nothing, and carried her across the threshold. Not of a new house, but of a new life. Execute passionate but safe, intimate scene. He did not set her down. He carried her through the quiet parlor and into the bedroom, the room she had once shared, but which was now, finally, just theirs. He set her on her feet beside the bed. The room was cool, the window open to the night. The moon was rising, casting a pale, silver light across the floor. They undressed each other slowly, with a reverence that was its own kind of prayer. It was not a frantic, hurried act. It was an unburdening. The muslin dress, her armor, his heavy belt, his defenses, all of it fell away. He kissed her. It was a continuation of the kiss at the spring, a continuation of the kiss on the cliff, a continuation of the vow he had made only hours before. It was a long, slow exploration of a promise. He led her to the bed, pulling back the quilt she had made. They lay down, face to face, the cool night air from the open window washing over them. Execute shoulder to cheek, shared breath. He held her, his arm a solid, warm weight, his body a shield. She rested her head on his shoulder, her hand flat on his chest, feeling the steady, slow beat of his heart. It was the only sound in the room, a rhythm that matched her own. They breathed together, in, out, a single, shared breath. Execute, camera pulls back. Wind, sage. The wind, their old companion, their adversary, stirred the simple curtains. It carried the scent of the high country sage, the smell of the dry earth, the smell of home. The camera of the mind pulls back, leaving them in the silver moonlight, leaving them to the quiet, unfolding language of healing. There, in the safety of the walls they had defended, in the peace they had bled for, there was no more fear. There was no more falling. It was not a joining of two broken halves. It was the meeting of two whole, scarred, and strong people. It was a long, slow, and sacred night, a final, quiet breath that said, "You are home. You are safe." Execute the coda. Later, much later, in the deep, quiet heart of the night. A small, tinny sound drifted from the living room. Lark had brought the music box in from the grave. It was sitting on the mantel, and a shift in the house had set its mechanism off. Its new, clear tune, a song of hope, plinked softly through the quiet house. Execute. Lark's head on Calder's chest. Lark, nestled in the curve of Calder's arm, her head on his chest, smiled in her sleep. Her hand, which had once gripped a shovel, was now execute laced in his. The healing was no longer a dream. Execute the final theme in Last Light Basin, where the sand scratches at your heels and the sun tries to burn you to the bone. You learn what's worth holding on to. Justice when it's earned, water when it's shared, and a hand that will not, under any circumstances, let you go when you fall apart. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I truly hope it brought you into the world we created. We would be honored if you'd let us know where you're listening from in the comments below. It's always amazing to see where these tales travel. If you enjoyed this journey, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and giving this video a like. And if you really want to help us out, please hit that hype button so this story can be heard by even more folks. Thank you again.